Hello and welcome to our live web conference, the Marine Renewable Energy Research and KE Programs. My name is Marilyn and I will be moderating today's session. I would now like to turn the conference over to Annie Lindley. Annie, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Marilyn. Well, welcome everybody to this, international marine renewable energy session to showcase the NERC Research and KE programs. We've located it at Ocean Business deliberately so that you good people have the opportunity to see what is on show here. And as the programs are just coming to an end, we'd like you to know about all the good work that has been done over the last few years. Some of you may not know how these programs originated, so I'm going to take a couple of minutes just to explain how they started. It goes right back to May 2009 when NERC actually commissioned some scoping reports, which both our good friend Paul Bell and myself were involved in, to have a careful look at the whole sector to understand where NERC research could actually deliver some useful science. We followed those scoping reports with a workshop in Liverpool where we mapped all the knowledge needs and issues in more detail with research end users, with regulators, industry, the statutory nature conservation bodies, and we produced a great long list of research needs and issues. And we used those, or at least the priorities that dropped out of that workshop, to inform a sandpit which NERC ran in December 2010 to actually scope some large research projects, take forward those priorities. And as you see in the circle at the bottom, we have the research program, which has run from 2011 to just recently, 2015, kind of joined at the hip to the KE program, which has actually taken forward some of those needs and issues from the Liverpool workshop, working with the research end users. And these two activities funded by NERC have actually built a very strong science and end user community, not just in the UK, but now spreading more widely internationally. In summary, the main research program involved 4 large projects. And you're going to hear more about those in a moment. But as you see from this scramble of logos around the outside, the projects involved a large number of universities, a couple of the NERC centres through, and the Scottish Association, and very importantly, EMEC, the testing centre in Orkney. And this group of universities has worked together collaboratively on the 4 projects. Some acronyms which I must say were made up in haste at the time in the sandpit: Flowbex, Response, QBEX and EBAL, all of which you're going to hear about today from the scientists involved in them. So that was the large core research program. And alongside it, the Knowledge Exchange program had another set of objectives, and these were mainly to facilitate the uptake of the NERC-funded research by businesses, regulators and policymakers, and to facilitate the innovation and translation of knowledge assets to serve the sector, and also importantly to provide a conduit for feedback from the research end users to inform future science strategy and investments. So what we were trying to do was speed up this process of translation from the core primary research to make it available to end users. And I must say this has been a very successful model because the information produced by the 4 main research projects has been taken up by regulators very rapidly in terms of consenting projects on the ground. The work of the KE program was guided by a program advisory group. As you see, we had industry, we had government, and we had Crown Estate, Marine School, all involved in this group to keep our work on track, which was focused mainly on where the gaps were recognised, on underwater noise, data access and management, cost-effective monitoring, cumulative impact assessment, and risk and uncertainty. And we have taken forward projects in those key priority areas. And thanks to our program advisory group, some of whom are here today, for the great work that they've done over the last 4 years in keeping our program on track. Just to give you a flavour of what we've actually produced in the KE program, I've summarised here the different activities which we've taken forward. There's a rather large number at the bottom here of 70, and breaking it down into the different types of activity, you'll see how we've used our funds. Right at the beginning, people said to us, workshops have to be focused. We don't want to be doing workshops which are not for a useful purpose. So every one of the workshops we've run has had that test applied to it. And over 4 years, 12 workshops, which have resulted in very useful outputs, plus 8 in brackets. We ran 4 at each of the EMA conferences, the environmental interactions with marine renewables, as an opportunity to keep the community together and focused on some of the problems. In the other categories, we've had 4 projects which broadly categorized as technology translation. We have supported a couple of industry research fora to ensure that the interaction between those stakeholders was maintained. We have supported 9 literature and technology reviews. We've helped 3 organizations improve their data and information management systems. We have developed 9 improved predictive or decision tools, and we have developed 9 new sets of guidance and protocols, mostly peer-reviewed, a few in the grey literature, to support regulators in their work. And we've also commissioned 3 reports which were for internal scoping purposes only. So over 4 years, that adds up to a lot of work and a lot of individuals involved in the program. If you look at the geographic spread of the projects, the black boxes basically are the research program partners, and you can see that we've engaged mainly with 15 key universities. There were actually 38 which expressed interest in the program when it kicked off, but in terms of trying to attract the right sort of science capability, we have located most of the work in those centers. And the green boxes show you where all the KE projects have been located. And you can see their clusters around EMEC, around SMRU, NERC, West Wales, and in the Primary region around universities Exeter, and another sort of blob around Cranfield and Oxford. So good spread geographically, and a large number of businesses and other organisations engaged in those projects. So the science has been driven by their needs to actually extract this information from the research base. So by way of introduction for these 2 programs, and so it's pretty much with, I hope it'll be a seamless transition to Paul Bell and his talk about the first of the research projects, Flowbeck. Paul is a senior scientist at the National Oceanography Centre in Liverpool. He has been much in demand since he started working on the X-band radar and developing this for resource assessment. In fact, I think so much in demand that your X-band radar is becoming like satellite dishes in certain parts of the country. So, Paul, I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Annie. Could I just give Annie a big round of applause for her astonishing management of the KE programme and all the amazing array of activities involved. Thank you, Annie. This is not, my talk is not covering the entirety of Flowbeck here today. There's just too much fantastic work going on in Flowbeck, so we're focusing in on a couple of different aspects I'm going to talk about the marine X-band radar and what we can do with that, as there's been a huge amount of interest in this across industry and, in fact, in other marine sectors. And I think following my talk, Benjamin Williamson over there will be saying a bit more about some of the acoustic work that's being done with a bottom-mounted frame that was deployed at the EMEX site. But there's so many other aspects. There's some benthic work in Strangford Lock that's been going on, HF radar developments in Plymouth, looking at longer range resource assessment, wave heights and currents. That there's just so much going on, but for now I'll focus in on this one. So application of marine X-band radar for resource assessment, it's probably not something a lot of you are familiar with. Why do we use the radar? What can we do with it? What can you see with it? I'll say a little bit about the background and show a few examples. So the idea with this is that by marine radar I mean a ship's radar, the sort of thing you see on a large vessel with a rotating antenna. It doesn't just see hard targets such as vessels and coastlines, you also get reflections off the sea surface, which is known as sea clutter. And that's, although the ship's captains want to get rid of that, that's our data. Signatures that you see on the sea clutter are influenced by the wind, the waves, and also what's going on within the water, the hydrodynamics of the area. And this is what we're trying to pick up with the first of the analyses we can throw at this. There are other analyses you can run on exactly the same data, the raw data. So we're starting to look at sea surface roughness signatures, and we're finding all sorts of amazing effects in those, which I'll go into in a little bit later. We've done some work over the years. We've observed that in calm weather, we can see birds and other beasties, I call them, because to us, they're just a radar target. We often cannot tell what the targets are that are moving around in the area. So there could be a bird, there could be something on the water, in the water. So generic term beasties, to excuse my technical terminology there. There's a further analysis, which I won't go into here, but was explained very well this morning with a PhD student, Kai Bird, which is waterline mapping. Kai, are you in here? And Alex? There you go. If you're interested in waterline mapping of intertidal areas, those are the guys to have a chat with afterwards as well. So I'll start with the wave inversion methodology, and the idea here is that as waves propagate into shallower water or into deeper water, the propagation is affected by the water depth in which they travel. So if you're traveling into shallower water, the waves slow down and the crests become closer together, and you can see that on the radar. I turned this on its head a long time ago and said, well, if it's affecting the waves, can we see the water depth with it? And the upshot is yes, and as a rule of thumb, looking at linear wave theory, waves start to feel the seabed at around half the wavelength of the waves. That's the theoretical limit. A more practical limit would be to say a quarter of the wavelength of the waves is about what you'll be able to detect with a wave inversion methodology. So when people say, how deep can you see with it? And the answer is, it depends what waves are there. It depends where you are. Wave inversion works primarily using linear wave theory. So there's a secondary effect on top of the wave shoaling, and that's if there's a mean current present. And that can introduce a Doppler shift to the wave spectrum. This slide goes through it, but I won't go on it in detail. But essentially, it shifts the spectrum in a way that we can measure and pick that up. And there's been a lot of work over the years by various groups, myself included, to try and develop better algorithms for locking onto this shift in the spectrum in what is sometimes very, very limited data, limited information within the wave spectrum of actually see with the radar. But this is the first deployment I'll talk about. This is at the European Marine Energy Centre up in Orkney, and they very kindly hosted, and are still hosting, a marine radar for us at the Fall of Warness site based on ED. And the radar is, you can see there in the bottom left, that's the ship's radar. It's got a 2.4 meter antenna, and in this case it was a high-speed one spinning at a rate of 1.4 seconds for each revolution. And we were recording 256 images in a row, which is just over 5 minutes of data. On that 5 minutes of data, that's essentially an animation of the sea surface of what's present, and everything else follows on from having that information. So in terms of performing the wave inversion, this is some very quick results. We didn't actually need to map the water depths at EMEC because they're perfectly well mapped, but it was a useful cross-check for the algorithm. The real aim for this was to get the tidal currents out. But on the right is the multi-beam survey carried out by the MCA at that site, and on the left is the water depth map calculated on the grid at which we're calculating the results. So we were getting measurements automatically roughly every 160, 180 meters on a grid across the whole site. And the upshot of that is that in summer last year, the algorithms became responsive and reliable enough to implement them in real time at EMEC on the machine up there. And the analysis runs automatically every half hour, and we get a map of the currents at that site, and it's fed directly to the website. And there's a link to that on the Flowback web page, which is given there just above the plots. The important thing you can probably see on these images, the one on the left is the ebb. There are areas where there aren't any current vectors. The colour is, by the way, is in meters second, so I think you'll appreciate these are some pretty strong currents that we're picking up there. Where there is insufficient declutter information in the raw radar data, there's no information for the analysis to work on, and so that area is blanked out. You just nothing to work with. So there has to be waves present. And that's a snapshot of the web page there, and you can click through the time series and watch the tide go in and out and the current swap around. It's great fun. That's now getting to the point where we have getting on a year of continuous data that's building up on that disk, and anyone here who's carried out tidal analysis will know that the longer you have of a time series of tidal information, the more tidal constituents you can pick out. So we've got nearly a year now, which is going to open up some very interesting analysis opportunities in this data. It is inherently patchy as well, though. I'll emphasize that. If it's calm weather, you basically get a blank picture. But it's not calm that often up in Orkney. There's usually a few waves around. This is another effect, the tidally modulated roughness. If you average out the wave signatures on the data, it's quite remarkable what emerges once you just smooth the waves away. And again, this is, I'll start with the multi-beam survey at the site. So on the left is the water depth. On the right is a gradient map. So the colour scale is very loosely related to the gradient of the seabed. And the yellow circles in there are locations of turbine foundation structures. What we observe in the radar data is if you take each 5-minute record and simply average through time, all the waves are smoothed out, but there are features in the sea surface roughness, and you can see here, you'll be able to see here, the lights will be better. There are shear zones around the headlands, very strong shear. There are features in the middle of the flow area which you might just be able to distinguish that seem to be related not to shear zones but perhaps to something in the bathymetry of the area, the water depth. So features on the seabed. And why these might be important is that if we're seeing signatures, roughness signatures on the sea surface that are generated from the seabed, there is a mechanism propagating that information, for want of a better word, up to the surface, and that is potentially turbulence, which may have an effect on turbine activity and survivability. So for instance, if you get an area of particularly strong sea surface roughness or particular evidence of a strong shear zone, you might perhaps want to consider whether that is the best place for a turbine or whether there might be less harsh environments. So looking in more detail at the more subtle features within those roughness images, on the left I've basically taken out the bulk changes in the roughness to reveal the finer details, like looking at the fingerprints of your fingers rather than the shape of your hand. And you can see from that roughness plot on the left, compared with the multi-beam derived gradient map on the right, many of the signatures in there are quite clearly related to the gradient of the seabed bathymetry, as well as some other features such as the shear zone on the going around the islands at the bottom in the left-hand image there. Interesting stuff. And the little circles on in the left-hand plot there, we are picking out signatures potentially from the structure, the turbine foundation structures on the seabed as an indicator. And my suspicion is that if we have a rotating turbine in there, we'll actually be able to visualize the wake of the turbine with this sort of technique. I'll plow on quickly. The other thing we can see is the birds. David McCann, who works with me. David, give a quick wave. So that is looking at, has developed a very good bird tracking algorithm, and we are looking at detectability of birds. What are we actually seeing in these targets? So we can understand detectability at ranges and angles and aspects of the way we're looking at it with the radar. And that will be a paper that's being submitted very soon. Frame was deployed in the same area, which Benjamin will talk about next, so I won't go into too much detail about that. But one of the things that was observed during one of the frame deployments was a swim past of a pair of male orcas, and I think the guys were gutted because they were busy manhandling the frame and couldn't take pictures of these two fantastic orcas that were breaching. And on the screen here, there's a number of blips which you may or may not be able to make out. Confirmed radar targets of swimming, breaching orcas. And we think this is the first validated measurement of orcas with radar. So there'll be something else coming out about that on swim speeds and breathing ratios and so on. The technique has been applied at Maygen. We did a 3-month deployment at Maygen field site in the north of Scotland with a portable radar system. Here's some quick results. The bathymetry is the bottom middle plot there. So that's a radar-derived water depth map of the area compared to the two areas on either side, which are the multi-beam areas. And in terms of currents, the middle plot is the one I want you to focus on. The red dots are the radar-derived currents. The black line is the depth mean of an ADCP record. We're pretty pleased with that comparison. I can go into more detail. There's other effects show up in the tidal analysis. You can see the mean currents, eddies around the headlands. It's phenomenal. We're also doing a bit of work that's spun out of this with the guys over at Force in the Bay of Fundy, Joel Colina and John there. They put a radar up there, and we're helping them out with the analysis as an ongoing collaboration. And I will stop there because I know I'm out of time. Thank you very much.
I think we're going to leave questions at the end of the first few talks.
Oh, that's fine.
I forgot to warn you that Eleanor was there in the driving seat for once. Time warning. We're moving swiftly on to Benjamin Williamson, who is going to talk about another part of the Flowback project. Benjamin has had the good fortune to be in the best Scott stable in Aberdeen through this work, and so has had a fantastic environment for taking Flowback forward. And I understand you've now secured a KTP with Maygen, which means you're going to be working presumably with the Scottish Government demonstration project going forward. So, Benjamin.
Well, thank you for the introduction, Annie and Eleanor. It's very much a collaboration, very much a team effort. Some of my co-authors and colleagues, Philippe Blondel, Beth Scott and Paul Bell are in the audience, so hopefully they can help me out with any questions. And as well, we should acknowledge the great help from Marine Scotland Science as well. This presentation is on the design, the development, and then the deployment of the Flowback seabed platform to monitor wildlife interactions and hydrodynamics around tidal turbines. So in the context of marine renewable energy around Scotland, I'll talk about some of our deployments so far at EMEC, at the wave and tidal energy test sites, and then go on to talk a little bit about some of the work which this has enabled, working with MageM, one of the first tidal arrays in the Pentland Firth. The frame itself, you can see it hopefully on the right-hand side here, being deployed at EMEC, at the tidal energy site. It's designed to sit on the seabed, facing upwards with various instruments to monitor the entire water column across physical and across trophic levels. So we can capture plankton, fish, seabirds, and potentially marine mammals as well. So look at the movement, behavior, and interactions of these different targets with marine renewable energy devices. The platform is self-contained in terms of power and data, which makes it portable between sites. So we can conduct studies prior to a tidal turbine being installed, for any cables, any anchors, any marker buoys, any subsea infrastructure. We can take that as a baseline study, then once the turbine's installed, deploy next to it, and then moving further away to look at things like gradients or distributions about sites as well. Thanks to the batteries and the data storage on board, we can continuously sample a spring-neat 2-week tidal cycle at a resolution of several measurements per second. The data from the subsea frames complemented by concurrent hydrodynamic model data, as well as above water radar that we just heard about from Paul, and shore-based bird observations. The 5 deployments that were completed so far at the EMEC tidal energy site, so hopefully you can see at the top right here, a deployment next to the open hydro subsea turbine structure, the Atlantis turbine structure, and then a control in an area of similar hydrodynamics but without a structure present, and then at the wave energy site in a tidally influenced and a non-tidally influenced area for comparison. And the base maps that you're seeing here of current speed are provided by our colleagues Pierre Cazenave and Ricardo Torres at the Plymouth Marine Laboratory, who provided these amazing 3D FVCOM outputs of both speed as well as some measures of hydrodynamics, which are really useful for contextual data as well. The radar we just heard about from Paul was deployed overlooking the area where the frame was deployed at the same period in time. So this gives us some great contextual data in terms of sea surface currents and roughness, as well as target tracking. And one of the things we're really excited about to work with Paul and David on is trying to link these above water measurements of targets, birds, potentially mammals on the surface, with our subsea measurements using the flowback frame. The instruments on the frame is an image at the left-hand side during a recovery. So you can see a couple of the instruments, and the schematic on the right-hand side shows the arrangement of various active acoustic instruments. We use a multi-frequency echo sounder, which gives us a quantitative measure of bird and fish abundance, as well as some metrics on school behavior. We can also use this for multi-frequency target identification, as well as metrics of the morphology of turbulence and zooplankton as well. Synchronize this with an Imagenics Delta T multi-beam sonar. So these 3 beams on the right-hand side are the upward-facing EK60, and this is the multi-beam swag. So the frames typically deployed at a standoff distance from a turbine structure, allowing you to image the entire water column with the multi-beam in the area leading up to the turbine. This pings at 7 or 8 frames per second, and so we can capture the interactions of fish, diving seabirds, and marine mammals with marine renewable energy devices. And from this high update rate as well, we can look at things like target tracking and evasion behavior as we track targets on their approach to the turbine structure or their departure from it. We also use an onboard ADV for high-frequency measurements of flow and turbulence, and we'll come on to some of the results from that later on, and the fluorometer to measure chlorophyll as a proxy for phytoplankton. To give you an idea of the kind of results we can get from the frame from deployments so far, on the left-hand side, this is an example image from the multi-beam. It's a composite of 7 seconds in time, and what we're tracking here, using this color scale from blue to red, is the movement of a large target swimming towards the open hydro seabed structure. That's typical multi-beam data. Typical EK60 data looks a little bit like an echogram you get from your boat surveys, except of course it's flipped upside down. So what we're looking at here on the x-axis, time, pinging from the seabed up to the water surface. And this is data from the EMEC wave energy site. And what we see at the sea surface is this large fish school persistent over the frame for several minutes, and then diving beneath it, guillemots and razorbills, so diving seabirds feeding on the fish school. For this instance, we can classify the acoustic targets using our shore-based bird observations, thanks to the patience and hard work of James Waggett, one of the PhD students on the project. We're able to take a ground truthing data set of known classified acoustic targets, and then use this to try to develop automated classification algorithms. Remembering this image that we see on the right-hand side here of the diving seabirds, this is a raw snapshot from the multibeam data to give you an idea of the data quality you can get from a self-contained platform. So again, at the wave energy site, so there's no turbine structure on the seabed, but we see the fish school near the sea surface, and then the diving seabirds beneath the fish school on this couple of group. So to give you an idea of the different target categories that we're able to pick up and that we're trying to classify into as a first step, we're now looking at 4 images from a 2-week deployment next to the Atlantis turbine structure. So in the EMEC tidal energy site, the tripod structure was there, and so in the center of each image, we can see this 10-meter high piling, and then one of the ballast blocks from the tripod structure, but there were no blades or no nacelle present for this deployment. So the dashed area here shows you the expected blade radius. And what we're looking at in these composite images is a large school of fish, in A, in B, a single solitary. In C, potentially a different species, a much more tightly grouped, smaller fish school, and in D, a diving seabird with this characteristic U-shaped dive. Thanks to the help and generosity of Carol Sparling, Gordon Hasty, and Anna Bird at St Andrews, I had the chance as well to gather some ground truthing data from the west coast. And so this is from a tidal path, Kyle Ray, on the west coast of Scotland, taking the multibeam sonar from the flowback frame, but mounting it onto a small boat in the tidal path with a high density of marine mammals to gather some ground truthing data in both a horizontal swath and as well in a vertical swath to gather 3D tracking of seals and their prey at this tidal path with concurrent multibeam data. You see at the top here this track of the seal with co-registered concurrent video, red line down here, and then photo identification at the bottom right. This is really exciting for us because it gives us concurrent video sonar ground truthing of predator-prey interactions in a high-energy tidal site. But as well, we can look at ecologically relevant turbulent features. So looking at the movement of the water, the hydrodynamics, with co-registered sonar and video to try and take some of this information from the west coast and apply it to what we're seeing at the tidal energy sites at EMEC. So what we see here are these whirlpools, these regions of shear between fast and slow water, seen on both the multibeam and the video. I'm sorry if the quality is not very clear. Please see me afterwards if you're interested in it. And the regions of upwelling and surface boils. We know that the animals are responding to these. We know that the predators are tuned into these, and potentially they're aggregating or disorientating prey. So a key understanding of this is needed for tidal energy sites. We can pick up this turbulence on both the multibeam and on the EK60 and on the ADV as well. So we're looking now at the EK60 sample data from the EMEC tidal energy site, and we see up at the sea surface these large boils extending down in the water column. First step, of course, if we're going to do any kind of biological analysis, is to exclude this turbulence. So with the work of Sean Fraser and other PhD students at the University of Aberdeen, we're developing algorithms to better mask this turbulence, to exclude it from the biological data, preserving it and parameterizing it as a covariate, potentially even a predictor of some of the ecology that we're seeing at these sites. Once the turbulence has been removed, we can then use the EK60 for this quantitative parameterization of biological targets, developing algorithms for school detection and parameterization, as you see for this example on the right-hand side. This fits into the multibeam target tracking as we try to co-register these 2 data sets to combine the various information gains from running the 2 at the same time. So we're looking again at a deployment next to the Atlantis turbine structure. It's pictured here on the right-hand side without the ballast blocks fitted to the legs. And so there's one ballast block here in the multibeam image, and then the expected blade radius up here. The first step is target detection on both the multibeam and then on the EK60 across the frequencies, and target tracking. And so again here we're using the color scale to track not only the movement and the directionality of this fish school, this time on its departure from the turbine structure, but as well looking at how the school evolves over time in terms of dispersion or other metrics. And then looking at multi-frequency analysis, comparing the frequency response on EK60 to the known frequency response of rare species in the literature. We can use this information to look at things like vertical distribution. What percentage of targets are going to be at a height in the water column where they're likely to encounter the turbine structure, or potentially moving blades when present. And if we zoom in on the lower region, then we see that although in this case there's a large distribution that's quite close to the sea surface, there's still a substantial number of targets at this lower levels of the water column where they will encounter the tidal turbine. If we take all of this information and look at the vertical distribution, in this case of fish schools above a couple of meters in dimensions, then we can look at how this vertical distribution changes with various covariates. In this case, we're looking at tidal velocity, the ebb and flood of the tide back and forth. And so along the x-axis here, we're looking at the tide in one direction, and then as it flips around and flows in the other direction. And each one of these dots is a fish school detected on the active acoustics on the flowback frame. And we see at the control site, so no turbine present, there's this distinctive pattern. When the flow is going in one direction, the fish schools are much lower in the water column compared to the other direction, much closer to the sea surface. If we compare this to the back-to-back deployment with the Atlantis turbine structure, so another 2-week deployment, immediately next to this one, just a few hundred meters away, we see a very different pattern. When the water is flowing in this direction, the right-hand side of the plot, there's a similar pattern. As the tide speed increases, the fish schools are lower in the water column. But on the left-hand side, this is the period when the flowback frame is in the wake of the turbine structure. And so we're seeing that these fish schools are substantially lower in the water column when they're in the wake of the turbine structure. We take the various hydrodynamic measurements and try and generate some reasoning for this. If we look at the turbine structure and the control site, we see there's fairly comparable hydrodynamic conditions. And this analysis is again the work of Sean Fraser at the University of Aberdeen. But we see there's a velocity deficit when we're in the wake of the structure, as measured by the flowback frame ADV. And this makes sense if you've got this huge turbine structure in the water column. But what's interesting is that the turbulence kinetic energy increases when you're in the wake of the turbine structure. It's consistently higher in this pink region here, which shows the period of time when the flowback frame is taking measurements in the turbine structure wake, despite the reduced velocity. So this suggests that there's a completely different flow structure, complete disruption of the large, natural, coherent motions with more intense, smaller scale turbulence. And this is informed by Sean's cross-correlation analysis of vertical and horizontal velocity components from the flowback frame. So we're trying to link the hydrodynamics with some of the ecology that we're seeing in these sites. We go up in scale here, and this is looking at some of the work of James Waggett and Beth Scott on the response project and how this complements the flowback frame. The frame gives you a single point temporal persistence for 2 weeks. The boat surveys give you a snapshot in time, but covering the entire site, with a survey route down here at the bottom left, covered about 100 times throughout the site, surveying hydrodynamics, seabirds, with the EK60 running, in this case from a boat, pinging downwards, over the areas where the frame was deployed. The work of James is trying to link physical conditions to prey availability, and then link this to the presence of foraging seabirds, with the idea being that potentially we can develop predictive tools to be able to go straight from suitable physical conditions to try to predict the presence of foraging seabirds, maybe avoiding the need for some of the high-effort prey availability surveys. So to summarize, we can use the flowback frame to investigate the ecological and environmental effects of installing and operating marine renewable energy devices, to investigate collision risk probabilities, and define vertical habitat use, as well as changes in habitat use, pre- and post-installation of devices for a whole range of species. This can increase our overall environmental understanding of mobile animal use at these high-energy sites, inform marine spatial planning, device design, licensing, and operation, to guide scaling up to arrays and new site selection. And the aim overall is to try to increase our predictive power, to be able to potentially reduce the level of monitoring required with each site in the future. Work of the flowback frame is taking steps forward to work with Maygen to inform their environmental monitoring program and the Pentland Firth. This is a really exciting project, working as a KTP, building in the work of the demonstration strategy project as well, to help them work through their various stages of consent. We've got an exciting future ahead of us. Thank you very much to our funders and our collaborators, and I'd welcome any questions afterwards, either by email or in person. Thank you.
Thank you, Ben. And you know, it's great that you're going to be continuing with Maygen in future. Now we have Ben Wilson talking about the Response Project. Ben is, he has a chair at the University of Highlands and Islands, and he also heads up the SANS Blue Energy Group. And we've come to expect the unexpected from Ben. So we look forward to his presentation.
I changed my talk right now. Hello everybody, and scream if you can't hear me. You can hear me? Yep. Louder, louder. Okay, right. More volume, more decibels. Right, okay, so I'm going to talk about the NERC response project, but Benjamin Williamson mentioned it a second ago as a kind of a bit of a spoiler. So this and the next talk, Gordon Hasty, Jay Thompson, are going to present another part of the response talk. So we're going to give a sort of double act in series. So I'm going to introduce kind of a bit of the background to both these talks now. And I will say it was NERC DEFRA project, which is a collaboration that led to the sand pit, which was several years ago now, and everybody that went to that remembers it very well. So that project started, and this talk is looking at the impact of turbine noise on harbour porpoises, use of playback experiments, and passive acoustic arrays. And I'd like to thank my co-authors, Stephen Benjamins and Jim Elliott, who are busy back at the lab carrying on doing the work. Right, how do I go? Down on there. No. I've done left, right. I've done all of them. That's unexpected. Are you happy? So which one did you press? That one, okay. Okay. I'm third in the talk so far, but in terms of issues for marine renewable energy devices or marine hydrokinetic, as folks in North America talk about, there are a number of issues, but really the big one of concern that's driving a lot of work is the idea that animals might bump into the ocean energy devices, and particularly pertinent is collisions with tidal turbines. And so that's one of the drivers, or it's one of the hardest things for us to get at because of the rarity of the devices, because of the difficulty of working in these sites, because they might occur at 2 in the morning on a windy night in a storm, for example. But it's to really get at what the impact of putting hydrokinetic devices, tidal turbines in these sites and interactions with wildlife. This is one of the biggest, toughest nuts we've got to crack. And most of the NERC DEFRA projects have some components of trying to help with this. And so what we decided to do in the response project was look at one of the kind of modifiers in relation to what collision risk for animals and turbines are. And that's look at how animals behave in time and space around turbines at near scale. And that will help us understand more. Why does it matter? Well, if you do encounter rate modeling or collision modeling or strike model of whatever flavor you do, you're usually looking at how many animals are in the area moving through, what's their chance of hitting a turbine if they ignore the turbine. The numbers usually come out as sort of frighteningly high in terms of consenting issues, European law, protected species, this kind of stuff. So if the animals were completely passive in the relationship, the strike rates could turn out to be prohibitively high for a fledgling industry. But of course we know from the bird offshore wind farm type work that animals don't act passively around turbines. They have behavior and they do things. So they could evade a turbine blade, get up close to it, and then dodge around the blade itself. We've termed evasion, so it's near scale response, or they might avoid it, so they might change their behavior at a scale that's relevant rather than individual bits of the structure to actually avoid the whole structure or avoid a whole array of structures. So they have different behavioral tools to modify the interaction rate that we might presume. However, we don't know what those are. So when we do encounter rate collision modeling, we don't know what number to plug in there for an avoidance response. And it could be an attractive response. We don't know at this point which way that goes. So the response project's really trying to give us some numbers, give us an idea of what might be going on. And Annie introduced the projects at the beginning. There were a lot of partners, and as Paul Bell said, I'm just going to give you a little bit of the project. There are lots of other bits associated. And these two talks, this and the next one, are going to focus on the marine mammal components. So what we hope to do is this is what we pledged to do December 2010, to measure fine-scale distribution of marine wildlife, marine mammals around marine renewable energy devices, device sites, to understand how they use such areas, and then to use acoustic playbacks to infer zones of influence and avoidance associated with tidal turbines. So that's what we said we'll do, and this is kind of what I'm presenting. Why are we doing playbacks? Well, one of the issues is that we're waiting for an industry to happen. It isn't something that's off the shelf and then the turbines just go in the sea and we go and have a look at those. This is a developing industry and going through various iterations of things, and knee deep in the valley of death right now and so on. And I think we need to get the biology up front to start understanding what's going on as the industry moves forward, to give the consenting agencies the confidence to say yes, go ahead. So if you think about an operating turbine in the sea, and we've all seen pictures like this, it's a bit dark, but there's a wee shark floating around swimming around at the bottom there, which links into a talk coming up a bit later on. That's what the artist sees, and that's what they give us to see. But this is what a marine mammal sees during the day, never mind about night or in a storm or in foul weather. So their perception of devices is primarily going to be acoustic. They're going to hear the devices. In order to do anything about it, they're going to have to know it's there, and they're probably going to hear it rather than see it, because if they're going to see it, it's going to be too late to do something about it. We focused on this project on the acoustic side of things. And so the idea was to do some controlled exposure of sound of generalized device noise. We're not doing a specific study. This is Research Council funding. We're trying to understand in a general kind of way what might be going on, and then quantify those changes in marine mammal behavior. So Gordon, who's speaking next, he's going to talk about some of the work with seals with telemetry devices on, and the shore-based observers. I'm sure I saw it with his hands like this once. And then, and I'm going to talk in this talk about harbour porpoises in relation to the playbacks picked up through a series of seabed-mounted porpoise detectors. Anybody who's in the game will know what I'm talking about when I talk about sea pod. But what they are is loggers of echolocation calls of porpoises. They're kind of cheap and cheerful. You can put lots of them out and get a 2 or 3 month perspective on the abundance of animals around, and the abundance of calling animals around a site. There's a sea pod going over the side on a mooring, so it gives you an idea of the scale. And what we did in terms of presentation of sound is this is with Paul Lepper at Loughborough, who's back in the audience. So any acoustic questions go to him. We have really hunted around for turbine noise, and that's one of the issues at the moment. There's a significant lack of information on operating turbine noise, acoustic outputs, for a ton of different reasons. And we really struggled when we set this experiment up to get turbine noise to then work with. So what we did is we took a guide of the MCT turbine and its acoustic output, and then generalized it into something a little bit more simple without the minutiae of that particular brand of device. And Paul came up with this, which looks like a logo at the bottom, but it's a broad, it's a series of tonal sounds for presumably the meshing gears and so on in the turbine, going from a few hundred hertz up to about 3 or 4 kilohertz. And just to bring it across, it sounds like that kind of sound. That's surprising enough. But now, during the sandpit, we were encouraged to position ourselves at EMEC to do this work. And after quite a lot of discussion and a bunch of meetings, we thought that it probably EMEC wouldn't be the right place to do this work. We're trying to look at the relationship between animals, individual animals, and operating tidal turbines. We decided to go to the the best places we could. And one of the issues with EMEC we've learned over the years, it's an extremely good place for doing work. There's a lot of activity there, but in terms of looking at how animals respond to a playback noise of a future turbine that some company might be building, EMEC is also a very busy place with other companies putting in and taking out devices, laying cables, whatever it might be. So being busy, quite industrial, it's a very good site for testing the engineering side of things, but for looking at how animals respond to a playback noise, it's not the best site. So we chose instead two sites on the west coast of Scotland that are of developer interest already. One was in Carlray that Benjamin Williamson mentioned a moment ago, and Gordon will be talking about in more detail. And we chose that for the harbour seal work. And for the harbour porpoise work, we chose the site down further down the west coast of Scotland, just off the island of Scarborough, which, if anybody sails, it's right next to the Corrie Brecon, which is a monster beast of a giant tidal resource in the area. And the reason we chose Scarborough is it's relatively quiet for trawl fishing. There's not dredging, and there's just pop fishing in the area, so we could go and meet those fishermen and talk to them. And also it's a bit of tide, but there's a lot of porpoises there, so that's why we went there. Here's a view of Scarborough from the island of Scarborough, looking north, and these black arrows here, you can see that that's the kind of bay we did the work in. It's several kilometres across. And if you want to see a marine chart of that, go to that's Glasgow Airport. We were in the departure lounge yesterday, and I noticed our study site is on one of the charts in the airport. So if you're up there, do look out for that. But the chart looks like this. It's a basin of about 100 up to about 150 meters deep. It's a couple of kilometers across, relatively small. It's a bit sheltered from the swell and the big seas. And the main attractive issue for us, beyond there being quite a lot of porpoises there, was that there was a small number of fishermen that we could interact with and talk to and get on side. And so we gave them this map and said, this is where we're going to put our seabed moorings. And then they said, well, we've got a bit of a problem if you put it there, because you move it there. We ended up with an array like this. There was one more. So we lost some because of the prawn fishery, but we managed to keep our experiment. And so we did that with some certainty they weren't going to trawl the whole lot up. They did trawl one of them up and returned it to us, which is very nice. Except it was right in the middle of the experiment, which wasn't perfect. But so what we had is a series of seabed-mounted pods at a range of distances from the speaker boat, which is there in the cross, and that also had a porpoise monitor on it at ground zero. So here's Stephen Benjamin's with a series of pods about to go out to sea, and Jim Elliott on the actual deployment. If anybody's worked in pods, you'll know that you do them in pairs because one of them is bound to screw up or fail. And we had one trawled up and then returned, and then we had one out of 22 pods we put in at 11 moorings. We had one failure, which happened to be at the ground zero, the most important one. So I'm really glad we had a backup. We had a second pod. And then at ground zero, we had a autonomous little boat with onboard computer amplifiers, and then a J11, a fairly significant underwater speaker dangled underneath it. And we set that up to, it was kind of solar powered for a while, but being Scotland didn't last so well. We had the speaker on and off for a series of randomized hour on, hour off periods for several days for the playback experiment. Here's the view from Scarborough looking at the study site, and you can see the experiment running perfectly well. You can see all of it. There's the speaker boat sitting there at sea happily on its own, and then on the seabed is a series of moorings looking at porpoise presence in the area. And so the moorings went in in June, came out in August, and the red bars are the periods that we did some intense 24-hour long, well, through the 24 hours playbacks. So this is playback period 1, where you have a series of offs and a series of ons. They were hour-long chunks in a kind of semi-randomized fashion, and then there's playback 2. And when we looked at the data, we found that the number of porpoises, this is just the output from one of the pods, the number of porpoises through the deployment gradually dropped down through that period. For some reason, there was less and less porpoises around. And these are during the playbacks. So for the actual experiment I'm going to talk about now, we focused on the first set of playbacks because it was a bit longer and there was more porpoises around at the time. So if we look at the results, right, so we did that, we ran the experiments. So what do we get on those? Right, what we got was basically no difference. There was no differences in porpoise detections, whether the speaker was on or off. That was looking at porpoise positive minutes. There's a zero inflation issue there because there's lots of times that porpoises aren't around. So if we just look at the times that porpoises were actually there, at the bottom graph, there was no difference. There was no demonstrable difference in any of the parameters we looked at so far in whether the speaker was playing or whether it wasn't. There was a non-response response for the response project, and it makes us think that if there are going to be interactions, it's going to be evasion rather than avoidance for harbour porpoises to this sort of acoustic signature. What we did find is a lot of difference between pods, the individual pods themselves across the array, which has been one of the interesting outcomes of this. What we find is that the ones in the centre and the deeper water picked up more porpoises, which is not surprising when you know about porpoise distribution. But there's some other interesting things that came out from it. If you look at the top graph there for one pod, you look at the 24-hour cycle from midnight to midnight with midday in the middle of that, you can see that there's a very strong dial pattern in the porpoise occurrence on that site. We've seen this in other places. But if we look at all the pods, we get the same thing at the pods on the northeast, but no signal whatsoever on the pods on the south of the area, certainly in the offshore area too. So there's a big difference on their dial behavior, even on that small scale of 2 kilometers. If we look at it for tidal, so that's tide with low tide being at the top of the watch circle, low tide, moving around back to low tide, that's one site, so there's no convincing tidal trend there. But if you look at all of the other ones, some of the areas, particularly down the southeast, there's a strong tidal pattern to their presence. So even on the scale of about 2 kilometers, we're getting big differences on how they're behaving relative to tide and time of day. Okay, to summarize, the playback method, I think it's a useful tool to test porpoise behavior prior to real deployments. Before a developer builds their turbines and decides their meshing ratios or their turbine resonant frequencies, whatever it might be, we can get an idea of how animals might behave in relation to that. We saw no major changes in porpoise acoustic behavior or distribution in relation to that particular turbine type playback. And it's maybe not such a fair thing because turbine noise tends to be quite low frequency, porpoise hearing is quite high frequency, so the overlap is relatively quite small in this case. If there are real sponsors to turbines, they're likely to occur at the close range rather than wide-scale avoidance. So that kind of helps us thinking about what monitoring we might be doing in the future. But porpoises showed significant spatial and temporal variation within a small area, which was unexpected. And so some of the moorings recorded strong dial variation, some showed tidal variation, others showed neither. So pods typically have been used for looking at hydrokinetic sites. It's usually one pod in the middle of the site, and I think we're coming around to arguing you've got to look at higher resolution than that. And so maybe if you're thinking about single tidal turbine, monitoring with a pod might do, but you can't do that if you're going to try and understand what's going on at the scale of an array. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Ben. That's very interesting. Next up we have Gordon Hesty. Gordon is a postdoc research fellow at St Andrews University, and he's going to tell us about the seal bit of
Great, thanks very much, and thank you, Ben, for giving a nice introduction to the Response project and certainly some of the overarching aims and some of the methods that we use. As Annie said, I'm going to talk a little bit about the seal component of the Response project. And as Ben mentioned, we chose to carry out the seal component of the Response project in this narrow channel between the Isle of Skye and the mainland here called Kyle. It's a channel about 600-700 meters wide and several kilometers long. And obviously it's a potential to provide tidal development site, so it has strong currents there. The ebb tide flows in a north to south direction, and the flood tide on a south to north direction. You can almost see our little playback boat here, which I'll mention later. So we as opposed to Ben, who used autonomous devices to track animals, we went about tracking animals by actually attaching telemetry devices to them. We deployed a total of 10 GPS tags on harbour seals that were caught within Calray using a small team of researchers in these two boats down here. And the animals are captured. The tags are superglued to the fur on the back of the neck of the animals. They were captured around end of March, April time, and the tags generally last about 3 to 4 months until the animals molt their fur at the end of July, August, at which point the tags fall off. And for some of these analyses, we also complemented this with 9 tags that were deployed in the same area the year before, which was funded by Scottish Natural Heritage and Marine Scotland. You can see the map on the right here shows the tracks of all 19 of our animals. You can see that the majority stayed sort of within and around the Isle of Skye. We had a couple of animals do fairly long trips, this one up to the north of the Western Isles, but in general they stayed around the Isle of Skye. But perhaps it was surprising to us when we actually looked at the actual channel itself. All of our seals, every single one of them, spent quite a significant percentage of time within this channel. A mean of 66% of the time was spent within the channel itself, and some of the animals spending almost 100% of the time throughout the summer in the small channel itself. And for a species that normally forages several tens of kilometres from their haul-out sites, this was quite surprising to us. And indeed, when we zoomed into the channel itself, we got an astonishing distribution pattern of the animals in there. The plot on the left shows all the locations within the tidal channel, and you can see this massive density of locations on the southern part of the channel. And on the right, we can see a sort of smooth density plot of those locations. And you can just pick up the haul-out rocks along the western edge of the channel there as well. It does seem that I guess the other thing to point out is that the disparity between the density of the animals in the southern part of the channel compared to the northern part of the channel. There's something clearly important going on for these animals in the southern part of the channel. As Ben said, we also carried out a series of land-based visual observations of animals during our time up there. We measured the number of animals hauled out and the number of animals in the water. And not only did this confirm the high density of animals in the southern part of the channel, but we also saw a really intriguing tidal pattern to the use of the area. This plot here shows the tidal cycle along the x-axis, where the blue line in the middle is high tide, the sort of left panel is the flood tide, and the right panel is the ebb tide. And you can see here the number of animals hauled out in the channel was very much at a minimum during that flood tide, but increased gradually throughout that ebb tide. And perhaps not surprisingly, when we look at the number of animals in the water, we see the exact opposite. The number of animals in the water was very much higher during that flood tide versus the ebb tide. And this, for us looking at harbour seal temporal patterns in musical tidal cycles, this is quite unusual. Normally what we see is animals hauled out very much over that low tide period, and not related to the flood ebb tide at all. But I think it's probably better illustrated by this quick video I've got. Obviously, you can see here our channel. You can just about see each of our little animals there as coloured arrows, and you'll see this red bar moves along the tidal phase here. At the moment, we're sort of just coming up towards low tide, and at this stage, all the animals are hauled out on the rocks along the side of the channel. And at this stage, the tide's slowly moving down from north to south, just getting towards slack. And you see, as we get towards slack, one or two of the animals start to come off the haul-out sites and head down to this southern part of the channel. The tide turns, and we slowly start to get a water movement from south to north. And you can see, as soon as the tide starts to turn, and the water starts moving up to the north, you see all the animals come off their haul-out sites and start to use this area really intensively down in the southern part of the channel. I said this is data from 2013, but all the animals in 2012, the 9 tags there, showed exactly the same pattern, using this southern part of the channel really intensively. You see, we're just past mid-tide there. We're starting to go on towards high tide there again, and you'll start to see some of the animals head back to the haul-out sites. As soon as the tide starts to slow, get towards slack, you see them head back to the haul-out sites and start to haul out on the rocks. And this, for animals hauling out at high tide, is incredibly unusual for harbour seals. So it's a really unusual pattern occurring in this type of environment. You see, there's a little bit of movement between haul-out rocks as we get towards the ebb tide, but eventually they all settle down and are happy with their haul-out sites. I guess the question for us is, what's driving this? What is it that's important about the southern part of this channel that's creating this unique pattern? From our visual observations from shore, we did see a very high number of prey capture events during that flood tide when the animals were down here. And we found the majority of prey capture events were this species that they were capturing, mackerel. And this is quite an unusual species for harbour seals to be foraging on. So it does seem that for some reason the interaction between this tidal channel and the flood tide is either increasing foraging efficiency or foraging opportunities, which is making this species of fish accessible to the harbour seals here. So as Ben introduced, we also carried out a series of acoustic playback responses to the animals to look at potential avoidance responses. The signals were based on CGen. The same as Ben described there, we had 12-hour playback periods. Within that, there was randomized 6 one-hour signal periods. And in Calray, we carried out a total of 125 hours of playback on 25 different days. And this bottom graph gives you a little bit of an illustration of the propagation loss at this one frequency. And this is work that Paul Lepper is currently doing at the moment. So in terms of evidence for avoidance, I think it's fair to say that we don't see any evidence of large-scale avoidance, as Ben mentioned, with the porpoises throughout the tidal channel here. Our left map here is during the silent period, the smooth density plot, and the right-hand panel is during the tidal turbine playback. And you can see the animals continue to move from the haul-out site and utilize this the top spot in the southern part of the channel, regardless of whether there was a playback going on or not. But I think it's when we start to zoom in a little bit further to look at some of the potential smaller scale responses that's going to be the interesting point. And we're currently working our way through the analysis of this, but to give you a little feeler for the kind of data we have, the little blue triangle represents our playback boat, and those little dots are individual seal surfacing locations. And I've color-coded these here in red if there was a playback occurring, or grey if there was a silent. Like I say, we're just getting a teeth into the analysis of this, but some very tentative evidence that there's some small-scale avoidance going on. This is quite a crude index of avoidance. It's simply the ratio of red dots to grey dots, where an index of less than 1 would indicate some degree of avoidance, and an index of greater than 1 would indicate some degree of it. You can see with distance from the playback boat, you can see at sort of 20, 40 meters that there's some potential evidence there that the animals are tending to avoid the playback boat during the playback period. And the other thing that we did during the response study was to carry out a series of controlled exposure experiments with our captive seals that we have at the Sea Mammal Research Unit. This is a home office license where we're allowed to bring in a number of seals for a short period. We can run a series of experiments on them, and then we release them. And for these experiments, we had 5 grey seals and 3 harbour seals, which have all now been released. And we have a large experimental pool at the Sea Mammal Research Unit, and this is a plan of it here. It's about 40 meters in length by about 6 meters wide. And what we had here was a surfacing chamber, so at one point where the animal could have access to the surface, and then we had a series of underwater lanes in the pool. And what we did was simulated 2 fish schools, a large fish school, a high-density fish school, and a small fish school, a small-density fish school at the ends of each of these lanes. What we were interested in as a sort of a general experiment was how these animals dive to these different prey patches, how long they spent there, how many fish they took, and they were free to choose whatever dive strategy they wanted to during these trials. And then we introduced a sound field into the pool, and we either located the speaker next to the high-density school or next to the low-density school. And we played one of these 3 acoustic treatments here. We had a pile driving signal, which is obviously a short pulse signal. We had the tidal turbine signal that we used that was the same as Ben's, and we also had a silent control. And what we were interested in here was just how the animals responded to it. Did they avoid the area altogether? Did they refuse to dive? And if they did dive, how did their foraging decisions take place? Did they choose to forage at the high-density school or the low-density school? And how did this feed through to the foraging success during the trial? So how many fish did they actually eat under the different acoustic treatments? And it's this latter part that I think we're getting some very interesting results in terms of the foraging success. This plot here shows the consecutive number of dives that each animal took during the trials, from 0 to about 30. And then on the y-axis we have the proportion of fish that were consumed during those trials. Each of the seals had access to about 100 fish split between the 2 schools. So that's simply the proportion of fish that were consumed during the trial. as you can see, there's this sort of relationship as the animals steadily consume a little bit more and more fish during the trials. And the two different colours of the lines here represent whether the speaker was located at the high density school or whether it was located at the low density school. So as you'd imagine, for the silent control, there's very little difference between the two relationships. But when we play the tidal turbine noise, what you do see is that the overall foraging efficiency in both treatments does drop a little bit. But it's slightly more obvious when the speaker is located at the low density school, you see a lower foraging success over the trials. And this is even more obvious when you play the power driving signal to the animals. Foraging success when the speaker is located at a low density school is far lower than it is when it's located at a high density school. And we're just trying to get our heads around what the mechanism for this might be, but it seems to be what's happening is that the animal's motivation to feed at that high density school effectively outweighs any kind of avoidance response to the acoustic signal. But the sort of double negative of a low density school and the high noise level effectively means that the animals will avoid the low density school when the speaker is located there. And this seems to be feeding through to a change in foraging success throughout these trials. To quickly summarize, I think the study's done a really nice job of describing how animals use some of these tidal environments. We picked up a very intensive use of a highly localized part of a tidal channel here. This is probably one of the highest densities of harbor seals that we have in Europe. We also see a very distinctive tidal pattern in the use of the channel. And I guess the question for the sort of wider industry is this unusual or is it unique indeed? It's clearly very different to the behavioral patterns we've seen of harbor seals in other places, but are we seeing this in other tidal areas around the It does seem that the behavior that's been carried out there suggests that there's either some kind of increased foraging opportunities or increased foraging efficiency during that flood tide. The playback system worked well to look at the potential avoidance of animals. However, animals did regularly move within relatively close proximity, within a few tens of meters to the operating tidal turbine playback. But there is some tentative evidence there that there's possible small-scale avoidance by the seals. From our controlled exposure in the captive environment, we do see some interesting results where we can see the noise from both tidal turbines and the power driving can influence foraging decisions by animals and does seem to feed through to the foraging success during these trials. And I think these kind of questions that it raises from here are really important when we're trying to predict behavioral responses by animals in the wild. The motivation for an animal to stay in a particular area is going to be a key in understanding how strong an avoidance response an animal is going to show. I guess some of the more general response summary points that Ben raised a couple of these already. I said that the methods seem to work well in the absence of a tractable operating tidal turbine, and it could be potentially used for future sound signature or for sound signatures of future turbine designs. Both the seals and the porpoises showed very distinctive spatial and temporal distributions within the tidal areas, highlighting that you need to be collecting the data at an appropriate spatial and temporal resolution. And lastly, we didn't see any major changes in the porpoise seal distribution in response to playbacks, but there's some tentative evidence there that there's a small scale of by the seals to the playbacks. And of course, this was a large project, a number of investigators, PIs and co-PIs, and a project like this really couldn't have happened without the effective collaboration between all these institutions. Thank you very much.
A bit of time. Great block of presentations, fascinating stuff. Just showcases the really hard work that has gone on over the last few years. Anybody got some questions? A question for?
I have a question. The operational noise that you play back, what torque level did you have?
That's an excellent question. Where's Paul Letter?
Right, I'll summarise that. Okay, it's the best series of talks ever. And then the other side was so what were for the playbacks? What were the output levels? What were the receive levels for the animals experiencing it? And all that, that's an active piece of work. We actually discussed some of that over lunch. So all the gear's gone off and got calibrated at the National Physical Laboratory a couple of weeks ago, a month ago, a few weeks ago, and our aspiration is to work out how loud it was, but also go to the point where to work out what the received level would have been for the animal at the location. So it's a series of modelling of the propagation in those sites to work out. So we're working towards the exact level. But it won't be as loud as the turbines themselves because the turbines are enormous and we cannot replicate that with the speaker, but we're doing our best.
Thank you, Ben. There was a question in the middle.
How many fatalities have there been for turbines? Well, first of all, bring us an industry and we'll let it go. There were relatively few operating turbines around. The key ones have been strength to loft. There's been quite a bit of work on, and maybe Gordon can say something about that. And also the work at EMEC as well to look at that. So we've got people in the audience to answer that question. Can we go first, Gordon?
Yeah, is anyone else from strength and loft? Okay, so I mean, once the strength and loft turbine had been operating for a while, there was a stranding scheme carried out throughout the initial operational phase of that, where necropsies were done on all the dead animals that washed up, and certainly in none of those was there any evidence of blunt force trauma. So there's no suggestion that any of those animals had been hit by the turbine. So no, I don't think we can, because I mean that's a single turbine. It's not been operating desperately long. And I think,
shut down every time
yeah, that's true. Yeah, there was a mitigation strategy in place there where every time an animal came close, it was shut down. So, I mean, what we do need is operating turbines that are actually not mitigated in that way.
You wanted to say something as to that? Just to add to that, there's a follow-on NERC project in development with the offshore renewable energy catapult at the moment to develop a collision detection system, so that there is actually basically a gizmo that we can attach to a turbine to detect collisions. And the idea is that it's integral to the condition monitoring system that the engineers would need to detect cracks and so on. And that project is just in development at the moment, and it's to go through the feasibility stage. So we're very aware of the problem. The issues are still very much a live issue. Thank you. Victoria, you had a question.
Actually, both projects in like high wildlife meaningful. Is there a point at which you can't carry out that area?
Do you want to reiterate the question for the people outside? The question was, so we picked areas that have very high densities of marine mammals. What about other areas? And I guess I was once in Florida doing some fieldwork with a guy working on, we were holding dolphins at the time that had just been captured, and I was thinking, isn't this amazing? He said, yes, the most valuable thing you can get in a grant is a plane ticket to the right place. And so we chose very carefully at these sites because we knew there were quite a lot of animals, so we'd have a hope of answering the question. So taking that to go to an actual developing site where there might be lower densities of animals will count against us. I don't think we shouldn't consider doing it anyway, because we could run these experiments much longer than we did. Or the other option is we take the sounds of a development, say maybe the Atlantis turbines that are going to go into Maygen or the Hammerfest, and then play those noises back to our kind of our tame study area animals, something like that. But it will be a challenge, but at least we've got to this point to start having that conversation. So.
Yeah. Can I add, it is a sort of trade-off there between trying to get the number of encounters to get the statistical power to actually say anything, but also if you have an area where the animals are at low density, they may have a very different motivation for being in that area. You might see a very different response in some of those lower density areas compared to a place like Calray, for example, where the animals are clearly very motivated to be in that area. But it's important to keep that in mind when you're trying to compare these different areas.
Any more? I'll just take one more from in the room, and then we'll go online. Yes, you, sir. Back.
Actually, on the word to ignore it, perhaps, whether there's a large structure which is out of many large structures which then are somewhere to be afraid of or be interested in, or there's no learned response in studies done. Is that right? And how would you make it?
I think that's an important point. I think one of the things you've got to think about is in an actual turbine event, there may not be the capacity to learn because it might be a fatal interaction first time. But it is a good point. I mean, and these are large, intelligent animals that very quickly learn to associate that noise in this particular site with, oh, that's that boat making that funny noise again. So you're right. I mean, in terms of, it's a first step to trying to understand some of the avoidance, but it's not the full answer. And we, if we're going to see a response, it may be in those very initial playbacks where the signal was novel. That it's a new sign to these animals, and you may get a very differential response before they've had time to learn what the signal's coming from.
I'm very glad you're even asking that question, because at the point when we get, when we had the sandpit several years ago and discussed these things, we didn't know kind of what we were dealing with at all. Now we're focusing down onto fine-scale responses. If an animal perceives a turbine, what does it learn, and that kind of stuff. Because one of the things that's kind of off the table for us is large-scale avoidance, barrier effects, animals no longer using that channel anymore, that kind of thing. So we can now focus our monitoring down to an appropriate scale for exactly as you asked the kind of question. So I'm glad we're having the conversation about thinking about it, because we don't know. There's a workshop in association with Maygen in the 5th of May. These kinds of things will be on the table to think about how do you monitor. Collisionometers have come in as something we're going to have to think about at the turbine scale of monitoring.
Okay. Is that all? Yes, I think so. And there are no questions online, so thanks very much, guys. We'll take a short break now. Right, we're moving on to our second block of presentations now. Starting with Dr. Helen Smith from University of Exeter. She's going to be telling us about optimizing array form and energy extraction and environmental benefit. So it's over to Helen. Thank you.
Thanks, Annie. Right, unlike the other projects, I'm going to be attempting to give you a bit of an overview of the whole of the EBAU project in this presentation. So I'll be touching on bits of work done by all the different partners within the group. This project started back in 2011, so back then 4 years ago, this was our kind of mission statement, as it were. This is what we were setting out to do. EBAU is very different from the other projects in this funding scheme because it's all about modelling. No field work involved, no measurement or anything. And the real aim of the project was to develop robust modelling methodologies that we can integrate in the marine energy design process. Looking at ways in which we can enhance the environment, further protect it, and integrate that as the projects move ahead. The project was run by the University of Edinburgh. We had 6 partners that you can see there. The key thing about this is that it was a very multidisciplinary project. We had physical modellers, ecological modellers, ecosystem, acoustic, and we were bringing all the different types of modelling together to develop these new methodologies. As with the other projects, a primary focus on wave and tidal, but again this one was slightly unique because we also extended it to look at offshore wind, primarily because we wanted to apply the techniques we were developing to really large arrays, and obviously that's where the big arrays are happening at the moment. Within the project though, we were mainly thinking in the context of 4 theoretical geographical scenarios. So a constrained channel, tidal site, the area between a mainland and an island, also a tidal site, an inshore site that could be wave, could be tidal, and then an offshore site, which would be an offshore wind type site. This was a 2-year project running from 2011, so the project's formally been over for 18 months or so now, but all this work that I'm going to be talking about today, it's ongoing. There are still, most of the partners still working on various aspects. And we've also had some follow-on work which has been funded by Exeter's NERC Impact. So these are the 3 key aims of the project. Firstly, to identify the key issues of environmental concern and uncertainty, then look at how we could develop new modelling approaches to address these, and then look at how we can include these developed methodologies in the integrated project design process. And what we wanted to do was move away from a project design cycle that looks something a bit like this, that's very focused just on the physical characteristics of the site, the constraints of the site, and then basically the environmental bit comes in, providing it meets all the regulatory requirements, it gets a tick. What we want to do is bring in the integrated ecological approach so that we're looking at these 2 aspects in parallel, basically, so that the design process can inform the ecological studies as the project design progresses, and that results from the ecological studies can feed back into the design process, perhaps allowing modifications to be made so that we can really maximise the environmental benefits. As I said, we identified a number of key issues for consideration. Obviously, it's a huge, huge area, a limited project time, so we wanted to focus down on a few key areas. So I'll run through these briefly. Then I'll finish up by just talking in a bit more detail about two particular case studies that brought a lot of these aspects together. So the first issue we looked at was the ratio of device to ambient noise. This is obviously important because in any marine site there's going to be background noise out there from waves, from current flows, etc. And then when you put a marine energy device in the site and you overlay it, there are going to be parts of the frequency range where the device from the noise from the device is going to be greater than the ambient background noise. And obviously that's going to vary depending whether you're looking at the lower energy sea states, higher energy sea states, and so on. And then what becomes interesting is when you start to look at the marine species that are out there. Species audiograms that define the regions over which the animals are able to hear noise, and where these sit in relation to this device noise. So some species might not be at all affected by devices. Other species, for example, might see a high level of device noise within their hearing range, and these could be very adversely affected. And moving on from this then, the next aspect to look at was how individual animals are reacting to devices on the basis that maybe some of the noise is being masked, some of their communication signals are being masked by the device noises. So the group up at SAMS and the group at St Andrews looked at developing in-house models where they could basically model the behaviour of the animals based on some of the issues such as these. So if an animal is sending out a communications whistle, animals at different distances from that are going to react differently. So if you can program these responses into a computer model, and then you can look at what happens when these signals start to be masked, we can start to assess the behaviour. The next stage is moving it further on, looking at large-scale acoustic exposure. So what happens when you have a potentially very large array of wind turbines, for example? How does that cumulative noise start to build up? What sort of variation do you see as you move across an array? How does this compare with the levels of background noise? How is this likely to affect the behaviour of the marine mammals? Are they going to see an array as an obstacle that they have to avoid completely? They're going to have to swim around? If that's the case, if we're talking about very large arrays, then there's a danger that you start to exclude all your top-level predators from a large area of sea. This could have a significant knock-on on the whole ecosystem. Linking in with this are the other large-scale physical impacts. What, for example, is going to happen to your waves, again, in a very large array? Lots of studies have been done looking at relatively small-scale wave farms, tidal farms, and so on. But here we were looking at something of the scale of thousands of turbines, split down into kind of smaller arrays there, as you can see. And if you look down the bottom here, you can see there's very little impact due to one or two turbines. But as you move through the array, this is waves and wind coming from the south, you can see this cumulative impact on the wave height really starts to build up. And finally, moving on from the physical impacts, we've got the large-scale ecosystem impacts. So, and again, in a large-scale wind array, you're going to see a reduction in wind speeds due to the turbines, due to the extraction of energy. This is going to lead to a reduction in wave height within the array because of the lower wind, but also because of interactions with the towers. If you've got lower wave height, then you're going to see less particle motion as you move down through the water column, less particle motion at the seabed, and this is going to lead to a reduction in resuspense sediment. So you're going to be seeing lower turbidity levels in the water column, and this allows greater penetration of sunlight. So you can start to get increased primary production, changes in the basic ecosystem, changes in the populations of microorganisms, and so on. So again, what are the wider impacts of this going to be? In terms of the two case studies, the first one is the marine mammal response to underwater noise. So this is kind of the theoretical, the modelling aspect that sits alongside some of the work that Ben's been talking about from the response project. And As I said, the team up at SAMS have developed this model that they were able to use to predict the impact of device noise on groups of mammals. And they were looking at two different scenarios. Firstly, the channel with up to 6 turbines, so the type of array we're likely to be seeing in the next few years. And then secondly, an open water area with up to 400 turbines, so much larger array. And two different types of group sizes. First of all, a pair of animals, so mother and calf, for example, and then a group of 10 animals, so a typical pod. And by programming in the behavioural characteristics of the animals, the swimming speed, the rate of whistles emitted, the probability of response to the whistles, and so on, and then by also programming in these sources of noise with an acoustic transmission loss applied, we're able to start seeing how these noises are going to be affecting. These are some of the results that were found, in this case for the pair of animals, the mother and calf, for example, and for different numbers of devices. So you can see here, for a single device, the separation between the animals over this 2,000-second run remains relatively consistent. They're not really bothered by it. As you increase that to 3 turbines, you start to see an increase in the separation, although the animals come back together. As you increase to 6 turbines, this becomes more significant. And as you increase the noise levels at the devices, up to 160 decibels there, you can see the impacts are increasing still more. But the team up there were also looking at how the mammals might adapt their behaviour to mitigate against some of these issues. So, for example, the dashed grey lines here show what happens if they increase their swim, kind of panic swimming to try and regroup, and also increasing their whistle rate, so increasingly trying to communicate again so that they can regroup. And you can see that in particular the increase in whistle rate is beginning to have an impact. It increases the probability that the group are likely to remain together. So in summary from this first case study, the modelling has shown that certainly arrays of marine energy devices do have the potential to impact on the movement and group cohesion of these mammals. You can't simply look at multiple devices as an additive process. You need to model each of these individual array designs. The impact could occur across a wider area than the immediate region of the devices. And in extreme cases, they have the potential to lead to permanent separation between the animals. Obviously, in the case of a mother and calf, for example, that could become quite serious. However, there are potential adaptations to the mammal's behaviour that may mediate against some of these issues. And there's also the potential for regrouping downstream in certain conditions. So the second case study then was moving away from the tidal arrays and looking at very large-scale offshore wind. So this was looking at a theoretical array of the scale that we haven't yet seen, but we might eventually be talking about. Up to 4,800 turbines we were looking at, working on the assumption that any array of that size would have to be divided into smaller farms, therefore providing kind of channels between these sub-arrays or sub-farms. We ran a number of studies investigating different farm and different turbine spacing. The team over at CFAS coupled a physical and biogeochemical model, and they used this to explore the potential effects of the wind energy extraction, so looking at that decrease in wind leading to decrease in wave, decrease in turbidity, and so on, to actually see over a number of years what would be the overall impact on nutrient concentrations and so on in the water column. Simultaneously, we were running these very large-scale wave models using SWAN, which we used to validate some of the predictions in the typical biogeochemical model, so for example, what the reduction in wave height across the array is likely to be. And also we were running the very large-scale acoustic models. This was the team at Loughborough, modelling each of those 4,800 turbines as a single sound source, so you can build up a real picture of the cumulative acoustics across the whole array. So these are the results of the biogeochemical model. You can see here, this is the area of the turbine with this black square here. So you can see we're starting off with a decrease in wave height in suspended sediment. And this is leading to an increase in primary production, secondary production. And then down here we've got an increase in the variance nutrients, microzooplankton, and so on. So there are clear changes to the ecosystem. Obviously, this is a very large array. Much smaller arrays, you're not going to be seeing anything like that type of thing, but it's a very interesting study. So these are the conclusions from that. Certainly these large arrays do have the potential to cause, maybe small, but they have a definite increase in food levels within the array. We're also going to experience reduced wave conditions in the array, but higher noise levels. You have a kind of combination of factors here. Firstly, providing an attraction to the marine mammals, increased food, calmer seas, offset by the deterrent, so the noise, the obstacles, and so on. The combined impact of these two is going to be very dependent on the array layout, on the individual spacing of turbines. And one of the conclusions that can clearly be drawn from this is that a smaller number of more powerful turbines are likely to cause less impact than the larger numbers of smaller ones. This is certainly the way the industry seems to be going. Just to finish up then, I mentioned that there's been some impact accelerator work following up on this. I've been doing this work down at Exeter, and the aim of this has been to increase industry awareness of the project, increase engagement with some of the outputs of the results. So as part of this, I've been carrying out a number of interviews with various industry stakeholders, so developers, regulators, consultants, and so on, to try and talk to them a bit more about this issue of integrating these ecological considerations into the design process, and also about general industry, academia, collaboration, and so on. One of the outputs is this brochure. I think there's still a few copies on the back table there. I know some people have picked them up already, where we're just attempting to put out an overview of the project, some of the outputs, away from the very academic literature. So just try and get the message out there about what we've been doing and providing links for people that want more information. So do pick up the brochure if you can. I'd be very grateful for any feedback. I'm just really interested in hearing if people think this type is useful, or how we could improve it or change it in the future. So do come have a chat to me about that. That'd be great. A few final thoughts then about the project. I think the first thing that eBay has shown is the value of the multidisciplinary modelling approach. So not just focusing on the environmental or ecological modelling, but also bringing in the physical impact, working with the acoustic teams and so on. So much of this work is still ongoing. There's a lot more of these interactions to explore. It's a shame the project was as short as it was, that we still feel there's a lot more we could do in this area. One of the issues that we really need to address, I think, and this goes for the wider industry, is data. I think someone, I can't remember who, was already talking about we need more, for example, acoustic data and so on. And there's all sorts of problems there, but it would be nice if there was a way to kind of take that forward. And I think the other thing that's really come out of my conversations with some of the industry stakeholders is the importance of communication, first of all between the environmental scientists and the project developers and engineers, but also between the academic researchers and the industry. The types of outputs that's coming out of these projects can be genuinely useful and incorporated into the industry, and don't just sit there in the academic literature and not go any further. That's it from me. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Helen. And now to Dave Sims. Dave is Senior Fellow at the Marine Biological Association in Plymouth. He has a joint appointment with the University of Southampton, and unsurprisingly, heads the Sims Centre.
It's not a centre.
Oh, it's Sims.
Oh, it's just a lab, a research group.
Lab.
Thanks very much. It's great to be here. I'm speaking as PI of the QBEX project, quantifying the benefits and impacts of fishery exclusion zones around these marine renewable energy installations. I'm speaking on behalf of a large group of people, the QBEX team. But for this talk, I'm going to focus just on the developments in fish telemetry. So understanding fish movements around offshore wind farms in particular. So why fish? I'm glad that you've all stayed on for the fishy part. We've had the fluffies and the featheries. Now there's the mucus or scales or whatever. But individual fish movement, which is what we're focusing on, is important to consider because, of course, the movement of those individuals influences the distribution of that population and the spatial abundance per unit area at any one time. So we're interested in the movements of things, species such as rays and flatfish interacting with these wind farms. Latterly, before and after installation, but also looking at movements around installations that have been there for some time. And what do these interactions mean in terms of the capture potential to the animals themselves? You can see there on the bottom right, a boatload full of rays that have been caught. So what does it mean, these interactions in terms of displacement or whatever for the animals themselves, but also for the fishing industry itself? So we had lots of questions at the start of the project. What overlap is there between fish and these installations? Do fish remain within the areas? Do they move away and then return? Are they displaced permanently? Are migratory routes affected? Do they aggregate in preferred habitat, necessarily having a reduced area after those installations were placed? And as a consequence, are they more vulnerable to spatially focused fishes? So lots of questions and lots to do. And it's important because, as I don't need to say to anyone in the room here, that the seabed around the UK is becoming increasingly demarcated for multiple uses, from conservation zones to energy extraction and aggregate. And so how fish utilize these spaces that are also being used for other purposes, human purposes, is interesting to know. And so the focus of the fish work in particular was to use novel tracking technologies to determine fish spatial movements across a wide range of scales. It may surprise you to know that it's actually very difficult to know where a bottom-dwelling fish is at any one time. So if we can't know where they are, we can't possibly gauge the impact of a particular installation or other type of exclusion on the fish. So very much a focus for us was to look at how fish movements are from meters to sort of hundreds of kilometers and minutes to years was our interest. We're interested in interactions and also most recently this before and after. So what were fish doing before an installation went in and what did they do after in terms of space use? And we're interested in modelling the potential impacts of that. I should say that QBEX is still going on, so I don't have the answers or even partial answers to most of these questions, but I will show you some of the results that we have so far. There was as I intimated, there was a large group of people with diverse skills, from fish telemetry and spatial analysis to modelling, benthic monitoring and analysis, data and socio-economic modelling. And so they were brought together and have been working for the last sort of 3 or so years. In this talk, I'll just talk about the archival tagging of fish. And you'll see there at the top, one of our goals was to tag large numbers of fish with long-term acoustic or archival tags. And the archival tags, as you can see there on the far left, are small devices that measure, that log pressure and temperature, and in some cases light as well. And these are attached either internally or externally to the fish. And so over the course of QBEX, we've been deploying devices in these areas. These areas were chosen because not only are there existing installations, marine renewable installations in those areas, but there are also ones being planned. And so this gives us a way of doing work now that in the future might become more useful in terms of looking at that after effect. And we looked at lots of different species as well, from cod and thornback ray to plaice and sole. I'll focus mainly on the rays in this talk. One of the key focus of our attention was to modify an existing tidal geolocation method, and this took some time to develop. The idea is that to track a bottom-dwelling fish, we can match the sine waves that we see recorded on these tags as the animal sits on the seabed. We can match that to the tidal signature geographically. This varies, of course, depending on where you are. So in this spot here, you can see the M2 amplitude plot, you can see that it varies as you go around geographically. And so the model that we used was based on the Pedersen 2008 model, and it matches the tidal pattern in the tag depth when the animal's resting on the bottom to the geographical domain of known tidal composition. And as you'll appreciate, this is a probabilistic method. And so we were able to improve the existing model by using much finer scale bathymetry as a layer in the model. And theoretically, you can get down to sort of 1 kilometer spatial scale, spatial resolution in that model. Now, this gives you an idea of what a static data looks like, and I'll just run this. You'll see the sine wave on the top. This is a tag sitting on the seabed, and you can see that there is this utilization distribution, this probabilistic distribution of where the tag should be. And where it's static, we would hope that that's quite a small circle of probability. We've got a good idea that the tag was there. If we look at, this is a thornback ray that was tagged near the North Hoyle wind farm. We can see some interesting behavior. The animal starts off near North Hoyle and very quickly in the November migrates west, spends the winter off the west side of Anglesey before around April time moving back into the area around the North Hoyle and Real Flats wind farms. So our interest there was to know to what degree were they using the space around this wind farm. Were they staying there all the time, or as the case in this animal, moving out and then moving back again? This was one of the thornback rays, and you can see the different color coding is different years. So in 2012, it migrated west to the east side of Anglesey before migrating back in the green color to this area around the wind farms, and then migrating again in that winter out to West Anglesey, and then migrating back again to those areas to just to the north of the wind farms. So the animals have obviously a migratory cycle. We don't know why they're migrating to those western sites. It might be for feeding opportunities or even egg-laying possibilities. But what we can see is that in a single animal, we can see that this is a repeated pattern and that they show site fidelity to those summer grounds near those wind farms. If we look at a number of different animals, so this is thornback rays, mature females, there in fact is different winter migratory routes that they take. And as you saw from the double migration, there seems to be fidelity to particular migratory routes. There's a western route and then a northern route also. And there are differences between age components in the population and also between sexes as well. So on the left, you can see immature females. Actually, they spend the year around those soft sediment substrata, around the wind farms, but also to the north, the Gwynty Moor development site. And when we were doing this tagging, that area was being developed and pile driven and so on. Mature males, interestingly enough, don't migrate. It seems they stay on the ground with those immature females. So clearly mature females and mature males are not necessarily wanting to be together all the time. Understandable, I'm sure. And what we can do from those higher resolution tracks of the fish is then to look at the overlap, the spatial and temporal overlap of the animals with these sort of planning areas, whether they're operational marine renewable sites or ones under construction or even ones which are planned. And what we find, interestingly, is that there aren't individuals that spend all of their time in one place. As you saw from those migratory sort of routes and so on, there are some that move out. But even the ones that stay, you can see here the two bottom sets of time plots. This is time going from left to right. And the color coding is just how many days they spent in an area, a marine renewable energy installation area. And even the ones that stay at home are moving out of those areas and moving in. And clearly, some of the sites are quite small, so that's understandable. But at the top there, you see our westerly migrators were in an area, Gwynty Moor, for example, and then you know, a year or so later would visit that area again. As part of that return migration, they were then moving into that area. So those animals aren't using the areas at all times. Overall, it's only about 6.7% of geolocated days are in overlapping completely those marine renewable sites. And so the more recent work that QBEX has been doing, and Julian's team at CFAS has been leading this aspect, is this idea of before and after study. The CFAS have an archive of tracks of different species, plaice and thornback ray and cod. And so it's possible to go back in time, essentially, and reanalyze, reconstruct those tracks using this modified method that we've developed within QBEX. And look then at these high resolution tracks, both before, and then we've linked this to new tagging as well, which I'll come on to. But we can look at how the animals some years ago were using that area, and then consequently the idea is to look at how those animals were using the areas after they have been developed, constructed, and then are operational. So you can see here for these examples of plaice, two different deployments in green and red, there's a good degree of overlap of those animals, highly migratory, and good overlap between them and these larger planned spatial areas. Of course, it does depend where your deployment is taking place, because obviously there's a greater chance of them overlapping if indeed you're tagging within that area. So over time, we would hope to deploy in areas where these planning areas were not, so as not to bias the approach. But then what can be done is, this is some historical tracks from sort of 2004, 2005. You can look at individual fish to see necessarily which different marine renewable installations they are overlapping with, and consequently what's happened in the last year or so is new tagging, which will enable us to compare what the animals are doing now with what they were doing in 2005 to 2009 and 1999 with 2004. So there is this opportunity for before and after studies using this modified method developed in QBEX. One thing we've also looked at or begun to look at is this idea of fisheries, the actual fishing vessels themselves and these marine renewable energy installations. And the MMO have provided data which isn't just the tracks of the vessels themselves, but also what they were catching in broad terms, so the landings. So this plot shows you the warmer the colour, the greater the tonnage of landing from that spatial location. And the thing to look at are these two areas here, Walney, which were obviously, this was before construction, and if we run it on, you can see what happens in the construction phase, and then where in this slide here, it's when it was fully operational. And so you see that the fishing vessels were not visiting that location, obviously, when it was under construction anymore. This is mainly mobile gear, towed mobile gear for nephrops and demersal fishes. And you might expect that there would be warmer colours around the outside of these sort of exclusion zones to that mobile gear. That's what's been seen in other locations in Canada and so on. But you get fishing vessels taking advantage of these exclusion zones, thinking that more fish might be within those exclusion zones than outside. But the picture is actually more complicated than that, because whilst on the one hand you can calculate the cost lost to the fishermen from not being able to visit that site, what you also see, if I go sort of back and run it again, is that there are lots of warm colours at the start in 2008, but by 2011, 2012, there's something else going on. There's been a reduction in the landings from that general area as a whole. So it's not just that fishing vessels are being excluded. Other things like management, for example, vessel reduction, but also maybe quota coming into this. So it's a reasonably complicated picture. VMS with the landings, essentially the value of catch, is a very good data set with which to test some of these ideas, and that's something that we're carrying on with in QBEX at the moment. And the last thing I want to mention is just some of the modeling work that's been going on. So it's taking the sort of telemetry and the ideas about fishing and exclusion and loss of catch, and putting that into a modeling scenario. So here's our slide again with lots of a patchwork of uses of UK waters, and we can simulate these sorts of patchwork quilts at 25% closure in a nominal geographical area as a single area, and also a 25% spatial closure as a multiple set of multiple areas. And by overlaying essentially a fishery model layer of mortality using the movements of fish that were empirically derived from our tagging, we can start to look at different scenarios. So we can compare the single closed area with multiple closed areas, and we can see that in fact the multiple closed area, as long as the fish move around quite a lot, actually decreases the catch loss in terms of the percent closed area. So multiple areas have the same effect as one single area, but only if fish movements are very limited in spatial scale. And these different scenarios can inform what we might expect to see in terms of catch and the effect on the animals of these different areas. So last slide, really just to conclude that, the sort of take-home message from the telemetry is that the tracked migratory fish show complex patterns of sex and age distribution differences, and they don't necessarily occupy areas around wind farms all the time, but they may come back to preferred areas. We can quantify the time using this method that they spend in these areas, and I think we've shown potential for the before and after tracking and the potential of VMS. I think the telemetry data-driven fishery simulations have real potential to deliver scenarios of what might be likely given a set of spatial planning exclusions. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thanks, Dave. And our final speaker in this block is Matthew Witt, who's research fellow at Exeter University, and you know Matt would rather be. Oh, I see. Oh, sorry.
Good fellow or lecturer.
Very good. You wish.
Yeah. I stand between you and your next coffee break. So I'll try and make this interesting for you. So at the University of Exeter, we've been working with QBEX with our partners, but our work largely focuses on the Wave Hub development site. And I'm going to speak to you today about two of the techniques we've been using. One is baited video, and the other one is experimental potting. And we're using these techniques to look at questions relating to resource overspill at a wave energy farm, in the hope that the techniques are transferable to other sites. So the example is niche, but we hope the technique is transferable. Nobody's really spoken about Wave Hub today, so I'll give you a little brief overview. This is the north coast of Cornwall in the southwest of the UK, and the Wave Hub is this kind of dock out at sea. It's about 18 kilometres offshore. It's grid connected to the mainland with 18 kilometres of cable, and about 75% of that cabling is rock dumps or armoured with rock, and the bit near shore is actually buried in the ground. And since 2008, the University of Exeter, through a whole range of funding sources, has worked at the site to try and build a comprehensive understanding of how the site is changing or not with respect to the development of the Wave Hub site. Wave Hub has been comparatively quiet since its inception. It was deployed in 2010, and surveying has carried on from 2008 through to the current day. So our overarching aim for our QBEX related work, and really this is our overarching aim for our entire reason for existence at Wave Hub, I suppose, is to increase knowledge on marine aquatic resources at the site. And with the flavour of QBEX, that's to look at overspill, or the potential for overspill in resources. So these are things that you might imagine like fish to fish. but also to increase our understanding of natural variation at the site, because you can't really make conclusions about what wave energy devices might do to the environment unless you constrain your understanding of the environment, the natural environment, exceptionally well. And one of the largest things that's come out of our work is just the sheer amount of time and sampling effort you need to put in to make sure you understand environmental variation well before you go off and start to suggest the device is or isn't having an effect. So our focus of interest is A, at the development site, and B, along the cable route out to the site. And why is Wave Hub interesting alongside the fact that it will deliver us lower carbon energy and potentially commerce and finance? Well, they're the issues that you may relieve the seabed from bottom trawling. That in itself might be beneficial. There's also the fact that you may or may not get improved catches around the periphery of the development. And there's also suggestions about integration of renewable energy sites into existing MPA networks, for example. So really we want to kind of understand that can we observe overspill, and maybe are renewable energy sites good surrogates for MPAs or not? And from the rock armouring perspective, you might imagine if you do a little thought experiment, well, maybe crustaceans might benefit from this because you've just put down 80,000 tonnes of habitat for them. So we really want to look at, are crustaceans responding to this new habitat site, or is it more complex than just saying, yes, there are more crustaceans, are there more crabs, are there more lobsters, will the fishery benefit or not? And ultimately, what from Wave Hub can we learn to take out to the wider world prior to really significant upscaling in renewable energies? And from our point of view, wave, but all of the techniques would work equally well for tidal or wind. The two techniques I'm going to talk to you today are one's called baited remote underwater video systems. These can be exceptionally expensive, or they can be quite cheap. Defined simply, they're a handy cam in a housing that you pop on the seabed, or you can have kind of £20,000 equivalents. We've kind of got things in the mid-range. And then we're also doing crustacean plotting, so attempting to replicate traditional methods used in that area of Cornwall so that the data we collect have relevance and they're not kind of instantly discounted because we use the technique that they don't. Those are our two main sampling approaches. Here's Wave Hub again, and I'll just talk you through the site. So out here you have the Wave Hub development, and all of these kind of coloured markers, circles and triangles represent Exeter's activities at the site, ranging from bird surveying to potting to camera work to long-term ambient sound monitoring, plankton sampling. Over a much larger area, we're working with CFAS to do hydroacoustic assessment of fisheries abundance. So it's quite a significant amount of work. But the camera and potting work happens at these circles here. These green and yellow circles indicate sampling locations for cameras and pots. So for the cameras, we're trying to assess macro-mobile fauna. So that really are things like crabs and fish, lobsters, octopus, small coastal sharks, etc. We've been doing it since 2010. We do 54 one-hour deployments a year. Some years we've been bolder, we've done double that. Most years we've reverted to a single sampling season. And really what the work is about remote camera work both on the cable routes and at the Wave Hub site, which we consider to be our treatments. So those are the human manipulation of that ecosystem. But we also do work off of the cable routes and away from the Wave Hub development site. And we consider those to be our reference sites. We don't call them control sites because we can't control everything at those areas away from development, but we do use them as a reference to understand what might be happening on areas that we've influenced. And really what we're trying to do is understand changes in community composition, species abundance patterns, species richness patterns, and also looking at behaviour. So CubeX is still running for us. We've managed to get a 1-year no-cost extension, so we're still working this year, and as such the data aren't analysed fully, but we've got some small bits just to share with you to give you a flavour of what's emerging. So each one of these kind of clusters of blobs here are where cameras have been put down year on year on year, the video's been watched, and we've extracted abundances, and this time it's of the dogfish or lesser or small spotted cat shark. And these abundances range from 1 up to tens. Sometimes you can get very few, and other times you can get a carpeted seabed of dogfish. These numbers just denote the sampling location number. But you can see that broadly, actually, there doesn't seem to be much difference on and off of the cable route in terms of numbers of dogfish. Different species, this time brown or edible crabs, which are commercially important in the area. And here again, these are just broad counts. And actually you see somewhat different pattern here that as you move offshore, so cable route here, which is near shore, so as you move offshore, you go deeper into about 50 meters of water. You actually see there's quite a noticeable pattern in brown crab abundance, and it's changed with depth. And the other technique we've been using is potting, and as I say, we use traditional pots that are used on that coast. We use the same techniques in which they're rigged and the same types of bait. We employ local fishermen to help us do it, so that we know that the data are somewhere getting towards representative of what the industry do. We look at edible crabs, we look at spider crabs and European lobsters. We repeat the work annually. We have done a few years again with 2 sampling bouts, one in the spring and autumn. Spring is most continuous in our time series. And similar to the Bruv work, this is an experiment about catch rates on the cable route compared to off the cable route, and in the wave hub compared to out of wave hub. All the crustaceans we catch are identified, sexed and measured. We do genetic analysis on the lobsters, or we pass samples on to colleagues for genetic analysis. And we've done some preliminary time-lapse camera work to look at what the optimal soak times for these pots. Not hugely successful at that, as you need a lot more money to do it. But we've done bits, we've made some inroads. And really what we're trying to do there is investigate changes in species abundance, both in our treatment and our control areas, or our treatment and our reference areas, body differences in body size on and off of the cable routes, and differences in things like sex ratio. And again, a small flavour of the data we're collecting. This is a frequency histogram. So on the x-axis, you've got body width of brown crabs. So you just measure the width from, it's quite simple, from here to here, pair of calipers. And what we're plotting out here is the frequency of the sizes we observe. And to the left, we have data collected off of the cable routes. And to the right, we have data collected on the cable. And that data set is still building. We definitely need another couple of years before we can get anywhere near to making some kind of robust statistical analyses of these things. Which brings me on to my discussion points. We hope to measure the effects of the wave energy devices and the infrastructure on the site. But actually measuring the impact is much more complicated. Impact is about understanding your effects with reference to the whole ecosystem of which those effects are happening. And impact level science needs to be much more wide scale over a longer temporal domain, which you no doubt guess is expensive. But don't underestimate the level of sampling that's required to make sampling and replication. You need to do this type of work because there are very high levels of interannual variation, and they may mask patterns, effects of devices on organisms and the biodiversity, but they may also have multiplicative or additive effects with the general responses to year-on-year changes in the environment. But it's important to acknowledge the limitations of the technology. We really are just looking at mobile macrobenthic fauna that we can see within range of the lens. But the work really does show that the types of volumes of sampling done for EIAs is nowhere near adequate to make some of the conclusions that you read about things not being significant. We're at 6 years on our seabird survey, and we're only just about asymptoting on the amount of natural variation we can describe over 6 to 8 years. We're still analysing. We can't really conclude yet, but we do have a multi-year pre-construction baseline. And for at least the cable route, we do have an experiment on and off once it was put in. But all the QBEC science is policy relevant, and it's aimed at answering questions like, do sites create resource overspill for fisheries and other benefits for those fisheries? And or can renewable energy sites help in some way towards maybe ecosystem restoration? That's a issue. Are these sites appropriate for integration into MPAs? I wonder whether we may see them being slowly filtered in the future. And really, are there net benefits or losses to ecosystem functions within the environments that host this technology? And the last point really is funding for impact. I think impact level research is really needed, and that's quite a significant funding input you need. It's more than the odd million here or there at the odd site. It's quite large scale, a bit like strategic environmental assessments for oil industry. I think that's kind of what we need for the renewable industry. just quickly, other data sets we've got and we've built over time to try and show that we're looking at WaveHub and the environment at an ecosystem level rather than just at niche bits of it. Monthly bird surveys were at 43. The ambient sound data set we're at nearly 4 years now, with about 85% kind of completeness. Small cetacean detection arrays been operational for about 6 years now, and we're working quite closely with CFAS with the EK60 fisheries Q6, but we've just bought an EK80 and a Kongsberg system, so we can now map this whole area in very fine centimetre detail, as well as go out and do species discrimination on fish. Here's a picture. These are blobs along linear transects at WaveHub. So this is WaveHub here, this is the periphery, and every single one of these blobs is a 50-metre integration of fisheries biomass detected by the EK60, and this is done with Julian Metcalf at CFAS. And we decided we would look at mid-pelagic fishes. And we were very lucky to receive some additional funding from the Impact Accelerator account at Exeter, which is funded by NERC, to build a data discovery tool so that the industry can interact with the types of data that have been collected at WaveHub. You can log on. It's in development still. I'm still populating it with information, but it's a metadata discovery tool, so you can't just download reams and reams of CSV files. But it does give you an idea of the spatial footprint of sampling effort, the frequencies, and little snippets of interesting things that will help you assess within the industry about whether you might want to do more sampling with your applications or less, or who you should interact with at the site before you were to take devices there, for example. Although we're not WaveHub, we're independent, but these are the data we've collected. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Matt. The others. Any questions?
There are, yeah, there are. Yeah, no, I'll reiterate. Yeah. So the question is, are there other fish tagging and tracking studies in other areas that we didn't study within QBEX that can contribute to a fuller understanding of how fish might use exclusion zones and so on? The answer to that is yes. There are a number of extensive programs of tagging of these demersally and commercially important fish. I mentioned the CFAS archive there. In fact, the number of fish is about 430 that have been tracked of various species. That's part of a wider, some of those are part of a wider EU project also. So it can even be up to 1,000 fish in some cases. But within the UK, there's that archive of data. And those are movements of fish. You know, they go from the southern North Sea through to the Western Channel and so on. Our own lab at the MBA in Plymouth, we have probably about 2/3 of that as an archive of other deployments. So, for example, off Plymouth, there are 5 areas that are now, mobile gear is excluded from those areas. And so we've been tracking before on lots of different species, up to 20 different species. So we have hundreds of tags returned. I mean, you put hundreds out and you don't get hundreds back. It's a fishery-dependent return rate. So there are, and in Scotland also, Marine Scotland are putting funds into tracking common skate, for example, is one of their species. They're using this sort of technology. So the method is there, and the number of studies are increasing. And I think what's probably required is for us to join these different data sets together in a large analysis of what a number of species, sympatric species, are doing in these UK waters relating to those spatial planning areas. So the question is, has anything been done to link the fish movements with the movements of mammals and the prey of the marine mammals? The answer to that is within the sort of marine renewable NERC DEFRA strategic program is no, not as yet. But as I mentioned, where you have these data archives, data that's already collected, it then becomes available for these larger scale, collaborative analyses. And clearly the marine mammal work, at least to a degree, was working at sort of a different scale. One of the things we were trying to do was get sort of fine scale, but try and step back and look at large scale movements through time, over a number of years. That's possible also with mammal data, but from the archive from previous studies out with, I think that's true to say, Dave, if you're still here, Dave Thompson, that there are other data of marine mammals, seals, and so on, that could be brought into it. You could start to look at interactions of fishes and seals. That is possible.
Okay, right, I'll try to do those one by one. So the first question was the rationale for a 4800 turbine array when the kind of biggest ones in planning at the moment, we're looking at about 400. Really, we wanted to go to the biggest that there might be. I mean, this was really looking at sort of future-proofing it 50 years in the future, and we were looking at potential North Sea sites where you might see a development of 500 going in the next sort of 10 years, which would be built up over the next 10 years and the next 10 years until you might end up with some. We really wanted to take it to the extreme, so we were looking at what's the maximum that might happen. The second question was the timescales. John might correct me, it was 30. And the third question, sorry.
Whether there's any opportunity in the future.
Sure. So that final part of the question was if there's an opportunity to rerun the module, rerun the model for smaller sites. I think because of the computational intensity and the resolution that we were running that aspect of the model at, we were really restricting ourselves to this very, very large site, which was another reason for kind of going to that sort of scale. Again, having talked to the CFAS guys, I think they have been increasing the resolution, haven't they? So that it's bringing in that possibility to start looking at that again, whether you would be seeing those effects at that sort of scale. There's all sorts of opportunities there to look at cumulative impacts of, a number of developments and so on.
Thank you. Richard Whitehouse from Excel. Thanks for the question for Matt. Given your couple of 100 hours plus of excellent videos on what we understand is a pretty rocky site, do you actually get any significant visibility issues where you say, well, I've done an hour of video there, I didn't actually see anything because the visibility is so bad? Or is it always so clear that you don't have that problem?
Yes, we get problems with visibility, and actually what we end up doing is sampling more than what we actually need, because we have an understanding that we lose about 30%. So therefore we sample more than what we expect we really need. So actually the surveys are around about 70 camera drops. Usually that comes down to around about 50 odd usable camera drops per deployment. So every site, every little mini site has replicates at it. So you can either average across them or discount one if it's in a particularly murky bit, or if you drop the camera down a hole, all sorts of stuff, which of course you don't know until you bring the camera up, unless you buy very expensive technology and beam the signal up the road to you in real time.
And the evidence of what the NERC is, what's causing the loss of visibility?
It's a whole range of things. Seabed NERC clears quite quickly. So when you drop the camera down, you get the big sediment plume. That's usually gone in about 2 to 3 minutes. If you're in a very spot where it's taking a while for it to settle out because you've got a low tidal speed, usually you'll get some NERC from like proteinaceous stuff in the water, and it might be at the time that you'd expect, kind of now actually, as things start to pick up in terms of productivity. You usually try and make sure you get in a bit of the tidal window that you don't think is significantly impacting what you might count, although we can actually drag that out of the data, and we're doing that at the moment. But you also make sure you get into a point where you've got enough water movement to kind of clear the water so you get the half-decent visibility. We only try for 1.5 meters at max. At the end of the pole, it's got food on the end.
Great, thank you. Eleanor, have you got any online queries? No, okay, they've been very quiet, haven't they? Yeah. Well, I think we'll break now, if that's all right. You could, any of you have further questions, take it up with our speakers. We are actually having some coffee and tea at this rate. So if we could aim to be back here by about 4:15, that would be great. Right, now we're now moving into the KE project. We're going to start with Steve Simpson, who's a lecturer and researcher at University of Exeter, formerly of Bristol University. Had a KE fellowship with NERC, and I think we've exploited your postgrad students as much as we possibly could, Steve, on this programme. They've been kept busy, haven't they?
I think supported is the word.
Yeah. Anyway, it's going to be Steve and Rick Andrews who are going to do a double act as a dynamic duo, I think. So, yes, Steve, over to you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. So, good afternoon. Really what I'd like to do is to introduce Rick's talk, but by doing that, I just want to explain some of the work that a group of us have been conducting over the last 5 years or so, combining research and knowledge exchange activities to assess and manage impacts of anthropogenic noise on fish and marine invertebrates. So we've already heard about noise being one of the challenges with offshore renewable energy. Why should we care about fish and invertebrates? Well, fish and invertebrates can hear, just as marine mammals can, and many fish use natural acoustic cues for habitat selection, so do some invertebrates. They use sound for finding food and for avoiding predators, and also produce sound for vocal communication. So fish and invertebrates live in an acoustic world. Like cetaceans, some fish, of course, are protected or of conservation concern, particularly in the UK migratory species like eels, salmon, shad. So we have some conservation concerns that bring in this challenge of the impacts of noise. Of course, many fish and invertebrates are commercially exploited, so are important for the economics of fisheries and increasingly for food security, and even for the mammals and seabirds that have probably attracted most of the attention on impacts of noise thus far. Fish and invertebrates underpin the marine food webs on which the mammals and the seabirds depend upon. So that's why we feel that it's important to consider fish and invertebrates when we think about impacts of noise. I'm going to just give you a couple of the highlights of the research that we've been conducting and also identify some of the knowledge exchange activities that have helped us to get there. And really I should acknowledge Andy Radford, my collaborator at Bristol, who shares leadership of this whole programme. So this really started with a DEFRA contract where we were charged with trying to assess whether fish and invertebrates might be affected by the impacts of noise. And it dovetailed very fortunately, both with me being awarded a NERC Knowledge Exchange Fellowship, which lasted for 4 years, but that started just after the founding of the Marine Renewable Energy Programme, including the knowledge exchange activity. So Annie's been a real mentor to me and also to many postdocs and PhD master's students that I've been supervising. So probably, once again, thanks to Annie. I think we should probably be thanking Annie about every 30 minutes through this session. We've had ongoing interactions with this Marine Renewable Energy Knowledge Exchange Programme in the work that we've been doing, and an important part of that was funding for a marine noise workshop that many of you attended and contributed to in Bristol in 2011, where as a group of biologists, we were really introduced to what the key challenges were. Some of the highlighted issues when we think about vertebrates were brought to us, and we were able to tailor our research as well as forge some very valuable relationships with the people who we've then been able to conduct that research with through the workshop. We now have case studentships both with CFAS and Marine Scotland working on impacts of noise, and you'll hear from Rick in a minute. Rick started with a business intern in NERC in marine renewable energy and has now been able to build that into a knowledge transfer partnership, and you'll hear some about some of the work that Rick has been leading in a few minutes. We also have some international collaborations that have come from the work that we've been doing on fish and invertebrates. We've very much taken a knowledge exchange approach. Now, probably most of you are fairly familiar with what knowledge exchange is and what knowledge exchange can achieve. If you're unfamiliar, then I encourage you just to have a look at a short film that was made around one of the knowledge exchange workshops that we organised up at NERC in Newcastle last year, that really captures from different perspectives why stakeholders found that interaction useful and how that then led to some of the work that we're doing last summer that you'll hear about from Rick. So in terms of the sorts of things we've been doing, looking at invertebrates, one of our model species in the UK has been a shore crab, and we found that noise, here we're using playback of ship noise, increases the metabolic rate of crabs, indicating that crabs can be stressed by noise. We also, when we look at crab behavior, find that noise can distract these crabs from feeding. It can affect how they respond to a predatory threat. And a PhD student of ours, Sophie, has also been working on noise in the tropics, looking at the effects of small boat noise. And by looking at the development of sea hares, so a mollusk, through embryonic and larval development, has found that boat noise can increase the likelihood of embryos failing to develop, failing to hatch, or once they do hatch, increases larval death. So suggesting that noise has the potential, of course we're using playback of noise here, to affect both mollusks and crustaceans. We were steered quite strongly by NERC and CFAS with the DEFRA project to consider migratory species, and so we focused on eels for part of that study. And we were also, largely from the knowledge exchange workshop, keen to try and get at some of the impact of noise that might carry direct fitness consequences. So one of the real challenges when you see that perhaps an animal moves slightly faster, stops foraging for a few minutes, or leaves an area, is to try and understand how that might then impact on the chances of survival, chances of reproduction of the animal. So with fish and invertebrates, we're obviously able to manipulate the experiments more. So we focused on impacts with survival consequences, considering juvenile eels. So these are the eels that would pass, coming back from the Sargasso Sea, through the busy shipping lanes of European coastlines to enter rivers. So what we found when we were thinking about whether noise has the potential to affect survival was that if we played sounds to our eels, this is recordings of ship noise, those eels that were in ambient noise conditions, the noise of a quiet harbour, when faced with the threat of a looming stimulus, simulating a predator attack, most of them startled. When we exposed these eels to ship noise, the majority didn't startle. So that could be stress, it could be distraction, or it could be both. But it increases the likelihood of failing to respond to a predatory threat. And when we look at the ventilation rate, looking at the opening and closing of the gills, we find if we play ambient noise and we switch to another ambient noise, no change in ventilation rate. But if we play ambient noise and then switch to recordings of ship noise, we see an increase in ventilation rate, another measure of stress. So noise is stressing our animals. But, of course, like these previous experiments, here we're using playback in tanks of those noises. And that's really where Rick will come in a second. We're now, through ongoing engagement, able to produce evidence that we're building the European noise. And this work has been fed into the Convention on Biological Diversity, and recently has been tabled to the Marine Environmental Protection Committee of the International Maritime Organization that govern global shipping through the IUCN delegation as an issue that really needs to be on the permanent agenda, the impact of noise of shipping. So what I've shown you so far has been lab-based experiments. It's given us the tools that we might then go and use in the real world to assess whether real-world noise sources have impacts on animals. And so hopefully that introduces what Rick will now talk to you about, which was an experiment and a program of knowledge exchange activities that we coordinated last year. Thank you, Rick.
Thank you very much, Steve. So I will tell you about a project we did, and so to do something in the field with a real noise source and going out of the aquaria, but in like a large area, as you can see in the picture. So first acknowledgement, again, I will also like to thank Annie Lindley very much again, because it's really true, she did like an amazing amount. Also here a couple of the funders, EON, GW4, NERC of course, and Marine Scotland were very important. So as you know, marine anthropogenic noise is actually a problem, and not only on land, but also on the water. We've heard shipping, for example, and another really big one is construction. You might be familiar with this picture on the left side, and it's basically, so the colorful ones is basically where wind farms are at the moment, are going to be built or might be built in the future. And if you just look at the size of that, it's actually really, really large. And since wind turbines are getting larger and larger, up to 200 meters nowadays, of course they need a very solid base. And this is mostly done by pile driving, which is noisy. A couple of other impacts of fish. So, of course, stress, they can damage hearing, impact on communication, but it can also lead to behaviors in the group, for example, increased aggression. So, although we do know a couple of the impacts of noise on fish, there's still an amazing amount of data that are missing. There are like 30,000 plus species of fish on the Earth, and at least 300 of them live in the North Sea. And because of the lack that we know about all these species, it is very difficult to say what actually might happen if we do any noise. So a couple of models, as we heard a little bit before as well, have been made, and their aim is basically to predict what fish, potentially even invertebrates, but mostly marine mammals might do when there's noise. Another model like this is the hammer model, and it predicts the movement of aquatic species in relation to noise. And of course, any model, whatever you look at, is of course as good as the data as is put in there. So the aim of our study was to actually obtain some real parameters to put in. So a lot of things you can do in the lab, but a couple of things that are difficult to get, of course, is like, for example, behavioral movement data. So let's say swimming speed, swimming distance, do some individuals actually avoid noise, might there be an impact of shoaling, and so forth and so on. We're also looking interested in physiology, so oxygen consumption, as you just heard from Steve, and for example, cortisol levels in the blood, which give you an idea of the stress levels of the animal. So we were mostly interested in commercially important fish species, so we chose black sea bream, Atlantic cod, and plaice. And although they're also interesting from a commercial point of view, they also have a different hearing. We can go and talk about it a little bit later, but just as you know. We did this in NERC, which is now part of the OR catapult, offshore renewable energy catapult. And this is the place we looked at. Of course, it was with water in there when we did it. But just to show you, it has a simulated seabed, which is, of course, great, so we can actually use flatfish to see if there's any potential of noise on these fish. As a noise source, we used a hydraulic post driver, which is something like this, which is farmers normally use to actually hammer in posts in the field. But the great thing with this is because they're actually hydraulic, you can just get a tractor and then you can actually hammer something in. So we didn't hammer something in, but we made our own pile. This is 7.5 meters long with a large plate in there. And the plate was there just to make sure that the pile kind of stayed in place and didn't damage the dock. It's really huge, as you can tell, and here just a couple of pictures, as you can see. So we also built scaffolding around it just to make sure it kind of stayed in place. So, and this is how it looked like when it was operated. It was hand operated by someone from NERC, this poor fella, but he did really well. So this is the sound field we created. We did and this is to give you an idea. So in this case, the location of the pile driver is over here, and the colors represent basically, in this case, the intensity of the noise. And of course, this is not perfect, but it's basically to give you an idea that closer to the pile, yes, there was a louder noise than further away. The schedule we had, we did 2 trials with the pile driver at 2 positions. The first one, as you can see over here, and the second trial was with the pile driver on the left side, like over here. We did 2 trials with 5 days, and in these 5 days we did 5 times a 2-hour sequence of piling with more or less 10 strikes a minute. So of course now we know the questions you wanted to ask, we know the fish you wanted to do it with. We had a noise source, but we still also needed a positioning system. So we used acoustic tags that we put in the fish, and these tags were actually emitting every 2.5 seconds a signal, which would then actually going to the hydrophones that we had put in the dock that went to a computer, and so we know exactly where the fish were. Just 1 second. So these tags are nowadays really nice and small, because this is one of these tags. So they're not big anymore, and they're basically the only reason the only normally reason for them to be big is because there's a large battery. So if you want pinging for a number of time, you need a larger battery. So this is actually one of the results. So I'm just showing you one fish. So this is the dock over here. This is the movement of one cod during ambient position. So the yellow dots you can see is basically where the cod is for the last 4 or 5 time steps, and the rest of the dots is where the cod used to be. So again, this is when there was no pile driving going on. This is 5 minutes, by the way. And now it's the same cod in basically the same time step when the piling started. And the pile driving, by the way, is over here where the hand is situated, the pointer. And I guess as you can tell, you can see that it might actually swim faster, and it also seems to be a little bit further away from the pile exactly right now. A couple of the other things we did. So we looked at, for example, swim distance, swim speed, and distance from the pile for all the fish species we put in the dock. And here I show you data of 5 minutes, so the 5 minutes before we started the piling, and the first 5 minutes during piling. For the first time, these fish actually heard the piling in the dock. And basically, it shows you on the left the distance swum per time step in meters. The blue one is the before in all the figures, and the red one is the during. And it shows you that during piling, so the cod actually increased the distance swum, also increased the swim speed, and increased the distance from the piling rig. So we did not only do this for a 1 2-hour piling sequence, but we did it for a lot of sequences. But just to get an idea, so what we can look at is, so here are all the sequences we did. We did 5 sequences. We looked at the 3 responses: distance from the piling rig, distance from the speed, and the swimming distance. And all the responses here that are listed are the ones that are actually significant. So if you just look for all the sequences, 1 to 5 over here, and all the analysis times, you can actually see that it seems like during piling, cod actually increased the swimming speed and the swimming distance, and also the distance that they are basically from the piling rig. So when we then go to the place, we see that all data is actually non-significant, which is actually what you might expect for a place, because a place is not a very good swimmer, and if there's any, let's say, any threat, the response of a place might be to do nothing and actually stay put. The bream over here have kind of a similar responses as the cod shown. However, it was a little bit less. We found less significant responses for the 3 time steps that we did. But we can say that we have an indication that that piling actually increased the swimming speed and the distance from the piling rig, especially short term. We also looked at oxygen consumption, in this case for the bream, and it was like during piling they consumed more oxygen than during ambient. And this is of course very similar to what we just saw on the left, but just take into account that here we have a real noise source. Of course, it's not exactly the same as a pile, but it was something banging very loud on something else. And we did the same thing also for place, and no difference was actually found between the ambient and the piling treatment. So just quickly to conclude, pile driving can actually impact on behavior. So for example, on swimming speed, the distance swum, and also the distance from the piling rig. And we also shown that there might be some impacts on oxygen consumption in these fish. So, but again, keep in mind that the impacts, of course, are dependent on the species, which there are actually quite a lot on in the UK. Of course, on the exposure to the piling, and also on the natural behavior of the species you're looking at. So what we then do with these data, so we will put it into the hammer model, which actually predicts the impact of noise on fish. So we can actually hopefully put the noise source somewhere else and actually might predict for these fish species what might be going on. We will also like to model energetic costs, because with a couple of the results we actually have these data now. And more importantly, we've shown actually that the site is actually very successful to do these kind of experiments, which nobody knew before. We'll also gather some more data, so boost sample sizes, look at different species that might be of interest for industry or for research. We can also now look at survival consequences, fry development, and reproductive success. We also had some particle motion things in there, so we do know what's going on, but we haven't really looked at in detail how to analyze this yet, and we would like to do it better next time, because we did learn an awful amount. And also to get some more ideas about, for example, reverberation, because of course this is not the deep sea, and just the dock, of course, there are quite a lot of reverberations. But there's not necessarily only like a disadvantage, because a lot of piling at the moment is going on also around the mainland, specifically at harbors and these places, which can be very, very useful to see how noise might propagate over there. And it would be great if we can actually do something similar, but then offshore, because this is, of course, it's still an amazing stepping stone to go from an aquarium to a really big aquarium, the dock 85 meters by 18 meters by 2.5 meters. You can definitely get some real good answers on there. But of course, you can't answer all the questions that you want to do. So if there's any chance to do something in offshore from a boat or anything, please contact us, and I'm sure we can do interesting studies. Thank you very much.
Yes, we unfortunately without Liz Marston today, but Angus Cook from BPO has very kindly offered to step in and tell us about the work that she's been doing on collision risk modelling. So thanks, Angus.
Yes, Liz sent her apologies, so but hopefully I can produce a decent summary of what she's been doing over the past year. This project, of course, didn't just involve myself and Liz, but it was also in collaboration with Ali McCluskey of RSPB, Marcus Cross of Scottish Power Renewables, Ian Davis of Marine Scotland Science, and Kit Hawkins from PMS and Renewables UK. I'm going to give a sort of general background to avian collision risk models, and then go through the sort of three different aspects of that Liz's project covered: a general review of collision risk models in use, some stakeholder interviews understanding how those models are used, and then the updates she's developed for the banned collision risk model. So, avian collision risks are quite often seen as one of the key environmental impacts arising as a result of offshore wind farms. So in order, as part of the environmental impact assessment process, collision risk models are therefore used to predict how many collisions are likely to occur within any given wind farm. These combine aspects of bird behaviour, such as the flight speed and birds, the sort of size and shape of the bird, and then combine that with aspects of the turbine, such as the height, the rotor speed, and the size of the blades. But one of the problems with this is there's no uncertainty or variation around any of these parameters. At the core, the collision risk models are usually a calculated probability of a bird colliding from a single transect. This is based on combining the bird and turbine inputs to work out what the probability of a bird and a turbine blade occupying the same place at the same time is, and then this value is scaled up using using baseline survey data to estimate the total number of birds passing through a turbine over a given time period, and then an element of bird behaviour, usually referred to as the avoidance rate, is added into this calculation to give a single estimated number of collisions. So there's as I said, there's problems with this. First of all, there's no uncertainty or variation around the values that are input into the model. So by variability, we mean the variation as a result of natural processes such as year-to-year, within-year variation in the number of birds present. And then uncertainty, we mean our ability to understand and measure the environment. So basically, how accurate are our measurements and estimates of the number of birds present. And because we don't have this information, the output from the model is usually a single estimated number of collisions. So as the first step of the project was a review of the avian collision risk model, and this led to sort of descriptive comparison of 10 different models. At the start of the project, the aim was to do a more quantitative comparison by sort of combining data and using a standardized set of data across a whole suite of models. Unfortunately, we found that the documentation surrounding the models wasn't actually that great, and when we tried contacting people behind the models, they sort of quoted things like commercial confidentiality and weren't willing to share the information we'd need to do that. So unfortunately, we ended up doing a descriptive comparison rather than a quantitative comparison. I don't expect you to read all these things. The main thing to take from this is that there are different models and they all do different things. If we look at some of them, we can see that some of these models, such as the McAdam model or the ICORN model, are based on other models. So we can also see that some of them incorporate aspects of stochasticity, but by no means do all of them. So we determined that none of the models out there at the minute do everything that we want them to do, but at the core, the models themselves are actually quite similar, and the differences are around the edges of the model. So we wanted to find out what might be wanted if we were to produce an updated or improved model. So to do this, we conducted some stakeholder interviews, and we identified 20 people from a whole range of stakeholders, including industry, regulators, and NGOs such as the RSPB, and we asked them questions about the CRI collision risk models and how they'd improve it and what things they'd like to see incorporated in the collision risk modelling process, whether they thought that variability and uncertainty would actually be a useful thing to include. One of the things that came through very strongly from these interviews was that the vast majority of people actually use the BAN model. So whilst there are a variety of other models, it seems to be the BAN model that's most popular. So some of the responses we get, there's a fixation on single numbers. We stop presenting single numbers as black and white, and also provide context. Decision makers have to be confident that they are making the right decisions, so they need to have an understanding of uncertainty around the single numbers. These sorts of responses are giving us a very clear guide that they don't like the way that collision risk estimates are presented as a sort of black and white, this is good, this is bad. There's concern over how reproducible some of the information is. It's not always clear and easy to follow through how the input values have been selected and then carried through the collision risk modelling process to give a final answer. And I think, particularly from a regulatory point of view, this was seen as quite important because people want to be able to follow a step-by-step process to see how developers and the consultants have come to the conclusions they have. But overall, the feeling was that producing a whole new model from scratch wouldn't be that beneficial. People would far rather see an updated version of the BAN collision risk model that sort of incorporates this variability and uncertainty and helps them to reach better conclusions. So the key things that we're focusing on when updating the model was was to sort of consider both the magnitude of the event and the likelihood of the currents, and to sort of just work out how sensitive the model was to changes, to uncertainty in any of the input values. Previous work's shown that it is quite sensitive to some of the input values, and we wanted to properly understand which values are important. So at its core, rather than doing a single run through, we produced a Monte Carlo version of the band model. So rather than inputting a single value for each parameter, we sample these parameters from a distribution defined by a mean and a standard deviation. We also included a link with wind speed data, because wind speed is going to influence both the rotor speed and the pitch, which might potentially be quite important parameters in the model. And rather, combining all that together, rather than producing a single number, we produce a distribution saying we think that the number of collisions is likely to be somewhere between these two values. We also did it in the R statistical package rather than in Excel. I think anyone that's tried using the band model in Excel probably knows quite how horrific it is, sitting there plugging numbers one by one and hitting go to get final answer. So we did it in the R statistical package, so you can give it the input data and it will run through and sample your variables and give you an output. The outputs we now give are figures and tables, as well as the actual input data. So these are things that can then be put straight into an impact assessment rather than having to sort of recalculate it and produce graphs yourself by hand. And then these outputs can then be put into population models like PBA and stuff to sort of look at what impact these things are likely to have at a population level. So the Monte Carlo simulation is basically a complicated way of saying we're just going to resample lots of things from lots of distribution, and these things are these distributions are defined by standard deviations and means around these means and standard deviations around these values. And so for each set of random samples, we'll calculate a likely collision estimate, and then we'll rerun it and rerun it. So if we do 100 iterations, 100 random samples of these data, will produce 100 different collision estimates, and then we can plot this as a distribution of collision estimates rather than presenting a single value. So the same basic data as the current band model are required, but the key difference is that we've got a mean and a standard deviation rather than a single value for each parameter. And then we also add in wind speed data, and we use this wind speed data to calculate a relationship between the rotor speed and the pitch. And this is based on information that we were supplied by industry and turbine manufacturers. The model itself is semi-automated, so you can put the input data into spreadsheets and basically hit go, and this will look through multiple species and multiple turbine designs over at a single time, and then the results will be output automatically to a location specified by the user. So the first types of outputs you get a sort of table summarising the number of collisions predicted for each species according to the turbine design you're using, and also according to the band model option. One of the key advances of the previous band model was that rather than just basing the collision estimates on a single flight height distribution, saying let's assume 10% of birds fly within the rotor swept area, it incorporated a sort of continuous flight height distribution, so you could take advantage of the fact that birds will fly at different heights, and those heights will vary in their collision risk. So we've got 3 different band model options, and the sort of first summary table produces all these values summarised, and then we also provide a sort of monthly summary of the collisions by species, and producing separate tables according to species, turbine, and model option. We produce box plots of the model options themselves and the monthly collision rates. So you can look to see how the number of collisions varies through time. This is useful if you're considering a species that might be migrating through the area to a particular time of year, or a species that's only present in the breeding season. So you can use these to hone in on which part of the year you think the key collision risk is likely to occur in. And then obviously we produce a sort of nice continuous distribution, so we can see how what the uncertainty around the collision rate is and how this varies according to the model option you're looking at. And you can sort of see how the uncertainty varies according to the model option that you use. You can compare. We produce similar plots for different turbine models, so you can then compare between different turbine models and say, okay, if I want to use a slightly bigger model or turbine or a slightly smaller turbine, how does that affect the distribution of collision estimates? And these sorts of things are likely to have applications to subsea turbines. We've heard this morning about the collision risk in the underwater environment. I think, and this is that technology is at a very much earlier stage, but I think it's quite important that we adapt the lessons that we've learned from the offshore wind industry to when we're developing models for the underwater collision risk models. And I think it's really important that there's this sort of cross-fertilization of ideas, because I think many of the problems that these underwater models will face have already been dealt with or considered in the offshore turbines. So in conclusion, we've produced a sort of Monte Carlo simulation band model which allows for the inclusion of variability and uncertainty in each of the input parameters. Similar principles can be applied when developing collision risk models for underwater turbines. There's the model description and the worked example will shortly be available on the NERC website alongside the R code, so people can go away and have a play around with the model and see how it works. Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much, Angus. Pity not to have Luke here, because actually this is an area of science which has been really dogging the whole offshore wind industry, and it was Andrew Pryor from Dong and Ewan Maguire from Vattenfall who originally helped us scope this project, so there was an even wider group of people involved in it. Right, next up, Linda Rodwell from the University of Plymouth. Linda was involved in setting up the Marine and Coastal Policy Unit with our dear departed friend Lawrence Mee some years ago, and has a flurry of postgraduate students, I think, around her, almost permanently. But we managed to lever your little cohort of postgrads into this project about interactions with fisheries. So thanks, Linda.
Thank you, Annie.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you for staying. I know it's been a lot of presentations today, very interesting ones. This one will be a little bit different in the sense that the focus is on people, and because we're talking about in this talk about interactions of marine renewable development and fisheries, and it links a little bit to what Dave Simmons was talking about and the work that they're doing in Quebec. So that was an interesting link to hear about there. So we're talking about fisheries, we're talking about renewables, and one thing I've learned about working with fishermen over the last 20 years, mainly on marine conservation zones really, is the difference between fishermen and working with animals, for example, is fishermen have opinions, very strong opinions. The other thing I've learned today is they're not as cute as harbour seals. So I think I made the wrong choice really. But what's very interesting is working with them and their opinions on things, and working with seeing how they can come together with other industries and come up with some sort of agreements, if you like, which is what this was really about. Okay, so I thought by way of introduction, sort of taking us back to basics about what fisheries is all about, and it's about this, getting fish onto your plate. All right, just to kind of wake you up a little bit, a show of hands, who eats fish? Okay, for those of you at home, and you can probably play this game at home if you like, it's most of the room eat fish. And so the perspective of the fisheries sector is that they provide a vital service to society. That's their perspective. And they provide a vital service to society by providing us with a food source. And with increasing population growth and so forth, then we're going to have increasing demand for food. One type of which is fish. And if you listen to the celebrity chefs, you'll also know that they're encouraging us to eat more and more of this. So there's going to be increasing demand for fish. So the fisheries sector remains resolute in their importance, if you like, as a significant sector. I could do the show of hands with this one, but I think I know the answer. Of course, energy sector. We all use energy. All right, and again, with increasing population and the types of lifestyles that we have, there's going to be increasing demand. All right, I know this is kind of obvious stuff and taking the big picture approach, but it's sometimes important to step back and remember that these two sectors are very large sectors, very important sectors in terms of what they produce, food or energy. All right, and with increasing population, we're going to need both. Right, so. So the challenge of this knowledge exchange program was to bring these sectors together and see if they could work together. So just by background as well, of course, and this is something that Dave mentioned as well, is that this is in the context of having to use the marine environment when there are so many other pressures on space in the marine environment. So we've got aggregates with it, we've got oil and gas as well, we shouldn't forget that. The one that was also mentioned, I think Matt mentioned it as well, was about marine conservation zones. Was that the fishermen have already gone through this process of the designation of marine conservation zones, and quite frankly feel fairly disenfranchised with the whole process because they were involved, they were, gave their opinions, they took part in the consultation process, and felt to some extent that their opinions and their input was ignored. So the background then is that the fisheries have this importance, but they also have this historical context that they have always fished. They have this historical rights to fish, and the marine renewables really are the new kid on the block. They're coming in and taking over some space, right? And so what we're dealing with is a polarization, if you like, of views. And even actually talking to people, a few people I've talked to in the last couple of days, I can see that those polarization of views are still there to some extent. In the renewables, you will be in at that mindset, and if you're in the fisheries, you will have that. So what we did, and this is really due to Annie, again, another thanks to Annie, but we set up this fisheries displacement and mitigation working group, which was basically, and sorry, I didn't acknowledge the people who also worked with me on this. Were three PhD students that were working at Plymouth at the time, Maria Campbell, Matt Ashley, and Iska de Groot. So really they did all the hard work actually, and I just had to what they were doing. But the aim of this displacement group, and I'll give you a little bit more background in a minute, was to promote this better understanding of the challenges faced of trying to bring these sectors together and this coexistence of these two sectors. And so trying to find measures, ways to improve that coexistence and mitigate the socioeconomic impact. So the title was about socioeconomic impact. Of course, fisheries displacement is a socioeconomic impact. And again, Dave mentioned there about you can measure these things in different ways, and I'll come to that in a minute. Why I think our role was quite important was we were from an academic institute, we were part of the Marine Coastal Policy Research Group based at Plymouth, but we could be objective. We were an objective research base, like our perspective was that way. We weren't partisan to one group or the other. And I think that was really very important. But just to give a timeline of sort of events, what first happened was Marco Polo, which is the Centre for Marine and Coastal Policy research at Plymouth, set up the first Marine and Coastal Policy Forum in 2011, and it was well attended, more so than we expected because it's the first of its kind. But in that, there was a workshop that Annie was involved in that was trying to discuss some of these issues about marine renewable fisheries. It was a little bit of an ad hoc one, but actually we didn't really know what was going to happen in it. And I wasn't involved in the sort of organisation of that particular workshop. But I went to it and found, of course, the room was packed. We had to bring in more chairs and so forth. And what it highlighted was this appetite for discussing these issues, socioeconomic impacts of development of marine renewables. And so that's what led to this funding, and Annie discussed with us and the 3 PhD students that were involved about this, having this mitigation group, displacement group. And what came from that then was the funding for 2 workshops and a survey. The scoping workshop was carried out in Orkney at the Environmental Interactions and conference up there, and came on the back of, we had a survey also of the participants. And not all participants were really interested in the fisheries aspect of things, so we didn't get a response from everyone, for example. But there were key questions in there. I'll go into that in a little bit more detail. This then led to an expert workshop in New York the following year in 2013. And then in 2014, we published an article which set out what was proposed by the stakeholders involved in that process of a mitigation agenda. And the other thing that sort of was going alongside this was a commissioned report for the NFFO and CFISH, a review of basically the current knowledge of the impacts of marine renewable development. So that's still to be finalised. That's quite a big piece of work that's gone longer than we hoped. So to show you, I know probably interested in who was involved in this, and just by way of an example, just saying this was the expert workshop of who was involved, engaging stakeholders. Of course, it's important to feel that you have engaged everyone that needs to be, and it's very difficult to do that. But what we felt, this is an expert workshop where people were invited, and we felt that the sectors, the research sector, if you like, the fisheries sector, the renewables, the development sector, and then the planning and conservation sector were well represented at this workshop. Unlike the scoping workshop, which is a bit more a bit of luck whether who turned up really, because it's a workshop linked to a conference. And in that one, the fisheries was very underrepresented. In this one, we had a good representation, we feel, from all these different sectors. So I don't expect you to read this. This is a poster that was presented at the International Conference for Ocean Energy in Halifax. This was November last year. And what I want to do is just highlight some parts of this. It's kind of summarize what we went through, the process we went through, and the results that came from it. So basically, the results are part of the process as well, if you like. So that first, the Orkney conference and the questionnaire focused on exploring what the knowledge exchange options were and looking at those research gaps and priority areas. So getting anyone to respond to those questions to kind of gather what areas we should be focusing on. And then the scoping workshop that went alongside this, we focused on these 4 questions. What are the priority issues? What are the barriers to progress? What are the mitigation options available? And what are the thoughts on the consultation process itself? What we found was 3 key themes that came out of this, that developed, and some of them have been mentioned today, which is kind of reassuring. One of them, a big one, was data, and this seems to be everyone agreed on this. That data, there are data needs that needed to be identified. So if we were going to assess or try to assess the socioeconomic impact, and we've heard a lot about the environmental impacts, perhaps the socioeconomic impact, what data do we need to be able to do that? All right, so what socioeconomic data, and Dave mentioned some of that in terms of fish landings, for example, over a period of time. Okay, and what also one of the key things that came out of the data side of things was how do we share data, and the fact that a lot of data might be available in existence but are not shared appropriately, and that the availability of data to everyone. Another category was assessment methods. How do we assess displacement of fishing effort. How do we actually do it? Now, Dave mentioned about VMS data, for example, and that's a really useful tool, if you like, for doing that, plotter data, mapping tools, and so forth. What we have to remember is those tools were not really designed specifically for measuring displacement. And therefore, the question arose was, are there other tools that we should be developing specifically for this purpose? And what I should have mentioned really is what's the role in all of this of marine spatial planning? Okay, because obviously with all those multiple uses of the marine environment, marine spatial planning might have a role to play in terms of mitigation of some of these effects. I think the key one that came out, and I think it was Helen that was mentioning this in her talk as well, was about communication, consultation, and collaboration. This one really struck home in the fact what I mentioned about fishermen becoming quite disenfranchised because when they feel they're not being heard or not being listened to, and that they are a stakeholder that should be brought to the table as a sort of equal partner, if you like. And the question mark over the legitimacy of the consultation process, if really it's just to tick a box, a legal requirement to have some consultation. Is it a true representation of fishers, for example? And what came out of it was more than I expected, really, was this desire for collaboration rather than consultation. Was fishermen wanted to be involved in collaborative projects. That was an interesting angle, to not just be consulted, but to be involved much more as. And the general, thank you, general communication was an issue in terms of improving that. So the expert workshop focused on the review of past research. It brought together all these experts that were mentioned before. It reviewed the case studies that had, to some extent, used mitigation payments, for example, to fund fuel depots or fund lobster hatcheries, for example, some things that were deemed successful from a fisheries perspective. But then recommendations to action, and then there was discussion on how to get some consensus on that action. It's all very well the fishermen saying, let's act on this, and the developers saying, let's act on this. But how do you come to some sort of agreement about what you should act on? What it led to was this mitigation agenda or toolkit, if you like, in terms of how the areas that should be focused on overcoming the data issues was one of those. Do we then think about a repository for data? Who should be administering that? Does this require a lot of funding? Who's the appropriate body to do this? Development of a consultation protocol to make it much more legitimate, make a formalized process for consultation where everyone comes to the table as equal partners, if you like, in the process, rather than the fisheries feeling like they are being dragged to the table and not part of not setting the agenda, as I think I was talking to Jenny about that earlier. And the development of methods for assessing displacement, so thinking about specific methods that could be used. So things that have been suggested are simulation gaming, for example, and other models that could be used to actually set out to assess that displacement. So we've put all this together in a paper. We've done it. There are reports available that have been widely disseminated, and we've had some very enthusiastic responses to the work and interest from Northern Ireland, from the US and so forth. And so we want that, obviously, the work to be widely disseminated to move on with other projects. I realise I'm running out of time, so I just want to finish on this, really. So where are we now? In reality, we were funded for 2 workshops and a survey. And what came out of those workshops was a real sense that there was better communication, more communication between these sectors, a sense of optimism, increasing engagement, and positive signs for mitigation. At that time, that really felt like we could move forward and get these people talking to each other and having a common agenda. And so, unlike these polar bears, I'm optimistic and excited about the prospect of decreased polarization between these sectors, these fisheries sector and the marine renewables. If we can decrease that polarization, bring people together with a common agenda, that's all for the good. But we need to take this further forward in terms of those 3 areas. I'm glad to hear that there are other projects going forward in terms of the data, for example, communication and so forth. But those things all need to be supported for future development. All right. Thank you very much. Yes, I was going to suggest we took questions on those three talks before I just did a kind of finale. Anyone has questions for Linda, Steve, Rick, or Angus? Last three talks, please. Any questions?
So we did a couple of experiments simultaneously. So for the movement experiments, which was our big experiment, the fish were swimming for 5 days. We could swim anywhere basically at the dock. For the oxygen consumption experiments, we had other fish, same species, the ones that are not had noise before, that were like in a small container, and for a certain amount of time, in this case 30 minutes, 10 meters from the tidal on the bottom, and we measured the dissolved oxygen contents of the water before and after 30 minutes. And so we did it actually. So for the same fish, showing the ambient and the tiling treatment, with half the fish first getting the tiling, and then the ambient, and the other half the fish first the ambient.
Thank you. Anyone else? Yes, Jared again.
As an EIA practitioner, I'm always interested to hear about new models, just to make my EIA even more complicated. So this hammer model, I was wondering if the output of the hammer model used in an EIA context, there's a spatial scale over which that might go.
I would say yes. So there's a couple of things. So I didn't really go into the hammer model. There's basically three parts of it. First of all, it takes into account the spreading of the noise with the underwater propagation, and it takes into account bathymetry, currents, and so forth and so on. And then it's the IDM or ADM, so the visual base model or agent base model, where we actually put the fish base. Put it all together. So it depends, of course, on the place where you're actually interested in, because that's the bathymetry data and the current data that go in, and then basically the fish. So I would say yes, that is our idea to actually improve this. And we're also looking, for example, because there are different fish species. Some, of course, they swim through. They are relatively easy to do, for us. But we're also trying to develop a system for fish that stay in the same area, because of course they might not even be able, just because of their ecology, because of their lifestyle, to actually move away to another place. They might, for example, have waited or fought almost all their life to get a certain territory. They have it, will they leave? Those are different questions. So, what answers?
Anything else? Yes, Ben.
For Angus, Liz, for the band model, the popular model, how do you validate? How many goes do this?
No, it hasn't, and I think that's one of the big problems of all propulsion mixed models. No one's actually attempted to validate them yet. And I think that's something that someone really needs to try and do.
Will work. And yes, Helen.
The fisheries people that you talked to, is that right around the UK? And if so, did you see any different?
To be honest, they were from around the UK, different areas, but I couldn't. There was no significant difference. What happened actually? What I didn't explain was these groups were the groups when at the workshops, they were mixed groups. So some of the fishermen, say from Scotland, for example, were sitting alongside people who might be involved in renewable development in the UK or whatever. So it was quite diverse groups, and it wasn't obvious that there was a difference. But I think that's something that could be explored more in terms of looking at that attitude in terms of the survey responses and what areas they're fishing and whether they're experiencing different things in Scotland to the UK to Wales and so forth. We didn't go into that in any detail, but I think that's a really interesting area to investigate, because of course there's different pressures in some ways in the different regions. So it's a good thing to do. As a matter of fact, since you ran the last workshop, we had a request from Northern Ireland to do a repeat for Northern Ireland, where there's a lot of conflict and actually just providing a platform for these two groups to sit down and thrash out the issues was actually very constructive. And so, yeah, I don't know whether we'll manage to do that, Linda, but
I mean, Matt Service was very keen for us to kind of replicate what we did here there, and that was all on the, then basically the funding was cut, and so that hasn't happened yet. It'd be very interesting to see, but we had Northern Ireland people there, Wales, we had UK, sorry, England and Scotland as well. So it was, it covered all the regions, but we didn't investigate whether those attitudes were significantly different between those fishes. Quite interesting question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, I was a request actually. Will we have access to the?
I think in most cases, yes, Eleanor. Yes. Did you catch that? You did, yes. So the idea was to make it available to everybody. And I mean, I think it's worth saying that, of course, we've only got a snapshot of the whole program here. This is, 3 knowledge exchange projects out of around about 60. So do look at the NERC website and see the reports as they basically come off the conveyor belt, because there's a lot more to come. I think I've got about 18 project reports still outstanding. So unfortunately, only half a day available to us. Thanks, folks. That was absolutely great. Now, before you all disappear, I'm going to explain this little yellow post-it note on your program. I really don't want this to be a requiem, as some people have described it. I tried to politely say it was a kind of swan song for these programs, but the reality is, of course, there is a great deal more work to do, and so I'm just going to talk for a few moments about where I think we are in this sector and where we possibly need to go, and to try and stimulate you all to provide some feedback on what your thinking is and how we can build on, what has been. It's been a great privilege, actually, for me to be associated with this program, and the really great work that's been done by all the people involved in it. But I would really like to try and ask you to apply your thoughts to where we might go in future. So I'm going to start by just mentioning what we all know really here, that despite the 2020 renewables targets, the UK, unfortunately, is just ahead of Malta in the European League table at the moment. This is despite the fact that we have got a massive opportunity in offshore renewables, actually, to go out there and deploy kit and generate energy. It's been very obvious through the run-up to the election next month that actually the whole question of energy and climate change has really been studiously avoided, apart from the cost of energy to the consumer, which, of course, in sectors where we are very much at the early stages, they're not mature industries, the cost obviously is much higher than those that are mature. But the good news for those in R&D at the moment is that there is significant investment coming through the European programmes, through Horizon 2020. And of course, this community that has developed as a result of the NERC programmes is really pursuing those opportunities. I think it's really interesting that at the moment we have had, literally in the last couple of weeks, we've had the World Bank President, Jim Yong Kim, UK, US universities and philanthropic foundations starting to call for the subsidies on fuels to be withdrawn. At the moment, there is a 6-fold factor difference between the subsidy for fossil fuels and for renewables, which means there really is not a level playing field out there for these sectors. So I suppose the question is really, is there a level playing field in sight? The withdrawal of the subsidy from fossil fuels would be a game changer for renewables. It's a bit of political context. The other context think about is that, and others have pointed this out today, that of course the offshore and coastal marine systems are changing really rapidly. We've got our economic footprint moving offshore all the time. We have expansion of offshore energy, wave tidal arrays, potentially floating wind, tidal lagoons, and new grid infrastructure. We've got oil and gas starting to decommission. We have increasing coastal defences for flood protection, expansion of offshore marine aquaculture, and consolidation and expansion of the MPA network. A massive increase in the intensity of space use against the background of ecosystem change, which we have barely got tabs on at the moment. So in trying to sort of capture this in one diagram, I've just developed this little cartoon here to perhaps provide some food for thought. The red block in the middle, 2015, is where we are now. We have 18 operational wind farms in the UK, I think 18 going on 20, and many more in planning. We have most of the tidal and wave research done so far in relation to single device testing. However, we're facing a future where tidal and wave arrays need to develop from the single device understanding. We have a lot of interest in the offshore wind sector in moving to floating wind as a means to reduce costs. Some say this will reduce the cost by a factor of 2. There are 4 UK demonstration projects in the pipeline for floating wind. We have the first tidal lagoon project in planning in Swansea Bay at the moment. 15 tidal lagoon sites are being looked at in the UK at the moment. 4 of those preliminary surveying work is underway. In bioenergy, we have proof of concept work and small-scale demonstration projects out there in the real world. So looking ahead 10, 20 years, we should be thinking about how we can use this body of research and knowledge, this community, to surely inform what we need to do in future. As far as the NERC agenda is concerned, there are common themes driving the NERC business and policy innovation theme. First of these is obviously the sustainable use of natural resources. Whether it's wind, wave, tidal, oil, gas, minerals, sustainable use for societal benefit is really right at the heart of the NERC strategy. We also have low carbon innovation and translation leading to greater cost and fuel efficiencies, dematerialization, and also to de-risk consenting and improve environmental management, all at the heart of this agenda. And we've tried to start this process in this program by showing how having broader and deeper understanding of the R&D can lead to greater confidence in terms of de-risking consenting. We also have a marine planning system in development and the Marine Strategy Framework Directive just starting to come online through the Celtic Sea initiative. So we really do need to ensure that we've got coordination and shared knowledge as a basis for innovation and translation going forward. So what I do think we have managed to show in these programs is that there is a modus operandi which has been quite well tested in this program to enable us to do this. Starting with the pipeline of strategic priorities in the middle for offshore energy. And at the moment, this could read 4 wave and tidal arrays for floating wind, for tidal lagoons, and so on. Those priorities need to be fed back to all the potential funders, to DEFRA, the Catapult, Carbon Trust, the Research Councils, Marine Scotland, and so on. And a program maintained which has collaborative effort from all these different participants, pushing forward the strategic agenda so that it is joined up and actually focused on what the priorities are for the industry. And this means that the outputs of those sorts of programs are that we have better technology, modelling and tools, we have research, demonstration and development projects, we have data repositories, archives and we have best practice position papers everybody can use for the benefit of industry. So the question is really, is there a need for NERC in future to be involved in this kind of activity? Certainly we have a need now to maximise the benefit of the NERC investments so far. You'll hear every academic who's in receipt of NERC funds worrying about impact, how to demonstrate impact, what is the impact of their research. This is massive. What has happened in the past often is that the investment in research is not followed up by translation for the end user need. And this is a massively important change in the way that NERC and the other research councils are doing their research. So Perigues, who supported and funded our knowledge exchange program, has started these impact accelerator grants to try and improve the processes of translation. So we still have to continue those processes in the offshore renewable energy sector to support scaling up from single devices to wave and tidal arrays. And we've got the first Maygen array going into Pentland first, well, starting to go into Pentland first very soon. We hopefully have the first wave array going into Wave Hub within the next 18 months. And we are going to see a major development in the offshore grid, and we're going to see floating wind coming online and tidal lagoons. A lot of the research done in this program needs to be translated for those sectors. We also need to integrate with other infrastructure in the marine system to ensure sustainable use. And this means linking up with those who are working in oil and gas, decommissioning, decommissioning platforms, pipelines, and so on, and also with the coastal engineers who are working on flood defences for flood risk mitigation and so on. So there is a massive agenda there, but what would be really helpful is to hear from you folks who've seen just a snapshot of this program, exactly where you think we could take this. I must say, having for the first time worked for NERC in this program, one of the really, really valuable aspects of it has been that we've been able to essentially be an honest broker in a landscape which is sometimes very polarized. NERC science is trusted, it's independent, and it is very high quality. And that is a very good starting point, bringing stakeholders from different aspects together. So please, even if you just give us a one-liner on your little yellow post-it note, I would be so delighted, because I'm going to prepare a bit of a summary for NERC in addition to our final report on the program. A little bit of a summary of, you know, where things are at the moment, what you folks think we should be doing next, and where NERC can really add value by bringing forward its investments in R&D, historical R&D. It has been quite remarkable to look at how far back we can go to translate some of the research for requirements now. So, you know, we're not talking about investment last week or the week before. We can often be talking about historical investments too. So please put on your thinking caps. I'd just like to say a very big thank you to you all for coming today, particularly for our speakers and for all of those who put time in organising. Eleanor, thank you very much, who has been an absolute rock in this programme, and of course Paul, who's held it all together. And to Perry Guest and Chris Franklin, who turned out their pockets repeatedly for us when we have had problems, and we much appreciate the support we've had from NERC through the whole programme. So please, as you go out, if you can think of anything useful or thought-provoking, it doesn't really matter if it's negative or positive, please get it down, because I will collate it all and put it together in you know, a scoping report or a little summary to think about where next. Okay? Thank you very much.